The house at 30 East Drive, located in the peaceful market town of Pontefract, appeared to be the ideal home for the Pritchard family. It was an unassuming, brick-built council house on the edge of Chesterfield Estate, with nothing to suggest that it would soon become the center of one of the most disturbing supernatural stories in Britain's history. Joe and Zhang Pritchard, along with their 2 children, Philip and Diane, moved into the house in the summer of 1966, hopeful and excited for their new life. Joe was a hard-working man, and Zhang was a devoted mother. Their son, Philip, was 15, a quiet and respectful boy, while their daughter, Diane, was 12, full of energy and spirit. They were an average family, hoping for a quiet and comfortable life in their new home. For a few days, everything was as normal as anyone could expect. The family went about their daily routines, settling into the neighborhood and decorating the house. The neighborhood was quiet, with friendly neighbors and a welcoming atmosphere. It seemed like the perfect place to build new memories. But it wasn't long before small, strange occurrences began to unsettle the family. Initially, these events were minor, barely noticeable in the hustle and bustle of daily life. It started with an odd feeling in certain rooms, a sudden, inexplicable chill in the air, or the sense of being watched, although no one was there. The family shrugged it off, thinking it was just their imaginations or the usual sounds of a settling house. Things soon escalated. One day, as Zhang was preparing lunch in the kitchen, she noticed a sudden gust of wind that seemed to blow through the room, despite the windows being closed. A light mist formed, and the temperature dropped noticeably. She shook it off, convinced it was some odd draft from the old windows, but the strange atmosphere lingered in her mind. Then came the small but disturbing incidents. Furniture would move ever so slightly when no one was in the room. Items would disappear and reappear in odd places, and lights would flicker as if there were electrical issues. Joe tried to rationalize these events, insisting it must be faulty wiring or simple household accidents. But Jan, always more sensitive to these things, began to feel uneasy. She had the growing suspicion that something was off, though she wasn't ready to voice it just yet. The turning point came during a family gathering. Joe's sister, Auntie Maud, was visiting. They were all sitting in the living room, enjoying tea, when suddenly a fine powder fell from above, like chalk dust. The strange part? There was no source for the powder. The ceiling and walls were intact, and there was no sign of damage. As the powder gently floated down, covering the furniture and settling into the fabric of their clothing, they all sat in stunned silence. Auntie Maud was the first to speak, breaking the uncomfortable quiet. "It's not natural," she said in a low voice, her face pale. "There's something in this house." Joe, ever the skeptic, brushed it off as debris from the roof. But deep down, he too began to feel a creeping unease. His rational explanations no longer seemed adequate, but he wasn't ready to admit that something inexplicable might be happening in his home. That night, things took a darker turn. As the family prepared for bed, Diane, their young daughter, let out a terrified scream from her room. The family rushed upstairs to find her sobbing, pointing to the corner of the room. She claimed she had seen a dark, shadowy figure standing there, watching her. Joe checked every corner, under the bed, and in the closet, but found nothing. Diane's terror seemed real, though, and Zhang couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was sharing their space. The disturbances continued, growing stronger and more frequent. The most unnerving events seemed to focus on Diane, as if something in the house had taken a particular interest in her. The family tried to carry on with life as usual, but it was becoming harder to ignore the mounting evidence that something was very wrong. Objects began to move more violently. Chairs would topple over. Doors would slam shut on their own, and the sound of footsteps echoed through empty rooms. One afternoon, when Philip was home alone, he experienced something he would never forget. As he sat in the living room reading, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped, and he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, only to see nothing. Then, without warning, the curtains by the window started to sway, as if caught by a breeze. Only the windows were closed. Philip froze, staring at the moving fabric, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of heavy, dragging footsteps filled the room, though no one was there. Terrified, he ran out of the house and didn't return until the rest of the family came home. It was becoming clear to everyone that the disturbances were not just random events or tricks of the mind. There was something else at work in 30 East Drive, something dark and malevolent. As days turned into weeks, the family could no longer deny the presence that haunted their home. Even the neighbors began to notice strange things, and word spread quickly through the small town of Pontefract. Though they tried to keep up appearances and carry on with their lives, the Pritchards were living in fear. They no longer felt safe in their own home, and as the activity escalated, they realized that the forces they were dealing with were far beyond anything they could understand or control. The Pritchards soon found themselves caught in a nightmare that would grow more terrifying with each passing day. Little did they know, their troubles had only just begun, and the figure that had first appeared in the corner of Diane's room would soon make its presence known in far more sinister ways. As the Pritchard family struggled to make sense of the eerie occurrences in their home, the atmosphere in 30 East Drive grew increasingly oppressive. It was no longer a question of random events. They were living alongside something unseen, something with an apparent will of its own. And, as many believed, the disturbances were tied to a sinister figure from Pontefract's past. The town's history held a dark secret that locals whispered about, especially those who lived near the area. According to legend, during the 16th century, a monk was executed for committing heinous acts. His death took place near what would later become Chequerfield Estate, where 30 East Drive now stood. Some believed that this monk's restless spirit had never left the land. They said he was filled with anger, and his presence was being felt again, this time by the Pritchards. The family, previously unaware of this history, began to wonder if the strange activity in their home could be connected to this dark past. Things took a dramatic turn when physical manifestations of the haunting began. No longer were these just odd sensations, noises, or moving objects. The spirit, or whatever force haunted the house, became much more direct in its approach. It started with Philip, the older child. One night, while he was in his bedroom, he felt an icy grip on his wrist, as though someone or something invisible had grabbed him. His arm was yanked so hard that he tumbled from his bed. Shaken, Philip scrambled to his feet, but when he looked around, there was no one there. His heart raced, and he ran to his parents, struggling to explain what had happened. Although Joe and Zhang tried to calm him down, they couldn't deny the growing sense of dread. Whatever was in their house had become more aggressive, and the family feared for their safety. Diane, however, seemed to be the primary target. The young girl began experiencing the most frightening events. One evening, as she was brushing her hair in front of the mirror, she suddenly felt her hair being pulled sharply backward, as if someone had yanked it. Diane spun around, expecting to see Philip playing a prank, but no one was there. Before she could scream, she was pushed by an unseen force, causing her to stumble to the floor. She was unharmed, but the shock and terror left her frozen in place, unable to speak. The Pritchards could no longer pretend that these incidents were mere coincidences. The physical attacks on Diane, in particular, were impossible to ignore. They reached out for help, but finding answers was no easy task. Joe, still a skeptic at heart, called in an electrician to check the wiring, thinking that faulty electricity might explain the flickering lights and odd noises. However, the electrician found no issues with the wiring, and the disturbances continued unabated. In desperation, Zhang turned to the local church. She invited a priest to bless the house, hoping that this would finally rid their home of the dark presence. The priest performed a blessing, walking from room to room, sprinkling holy water and offering prayers. But far from calming the situation, the activity only grew more intense after the priest's visit. Objects began flying across the room with violent force plates, books, even heavy furniture would move as if thrown by invisible hands. Doors would slam shut with such power that the entire house seemed to shake. The spirit appeared to be mocking their attempts to cleanse the house, growing bolder and more aggressive with each passing day. At this point, it was no longer just the Pritchards who were witnessing the strange events. Friends, relatives, and neighbors who visited the house reported seeing objects move on their own or hearing strange noises. One neighbor, who had always been a staunch skeptic of the supernatural, left the house in a panic after witnessing a chair slide across the room without anyone touching it. The haunting was becoming impossible to deny. It was during this time that the Pritchards learned about the infamous legend of the Black Monk. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the dark figure believed to haunt the land. The monk, they said, had been executed for crimes so terrible that his spirit was doomed to walk the earth, full of anger and vengeance. The family began to wonder if this malevolent presence could be the source of their suffering. The poltergeist activity seemed focused not only on Diane, but also on a particular area of the house, the staircase. Diane frequently felt the icy grip of an invisible hand on the back of her neck as she climbed the stairs, as though she was being watched or worse, followed. On several occasions, she was pushed or pulled as she ascended the steps, causing her to fall and bruise herself. These assaults left the young girl terrified to be alone in the house, and her previously bright and energetic demeanor began to fade. The disturbances escalated to the point that the family could no longer sleep peacefully. Loud bangs echoed through the house at all hours of the night, sometimes shaking the walls. Phantom footsteps could be heard pacing up and down the hallway. The family was trapped in a state of constant fear, unsure when or where the next attack would come. With no other options, the Pritchards contacted a team of paranormal investigators. The investigators, intrigued by the reports of such intense activity, arrived at 30 East Drive armed with cameras, recording equipment, and other tools designed to detect the presence of spirits. The investigators soon realized that they were dealing with a particularly strong entity. During their visit, they witnessed chairs being thrown across the room, doors slamming shut on their own, and eerie voices whispering in the air, though no one was speaking. One of the investigators reported seeing the dark outline of a figure at the top of the staircase, a tall hooded shape that seemed to watch them before disappearing into thin air. It was the first time the figure of the Black Monk had been seen in the house by an outsider, further fueling the belief that this malevolent force was behind the haunting. As the investigators left, they could offer no solutions, only confirmation that the Pritchards were not imagining the horrors they were experiencing. The spirit in their home was real, and it wasn't going anywhere. Despite all their efforts, the family remained at the mercy of the poltergeist. Every attempt to rid the house of the dark presence seemed to provoke it further. The Pritchards' lives were now dominated by fear, and the sense of normalcy they once enjoyed had been completely shattered. The legend of the Black Monk had become their reality, and they were powerless to escape its grasp. As the weeks passed, the disturbances in 30 East Drive reached an all-time high. What had once been small, unsettling incidents had now become violent and unpredictable. The Pritchard family lived in a constant state of anxiety, unsure of when the next outburst would occur or how severe it might be. It was during this time that the terrifying figure of the Black Monk became fully visible, and his presence would forever change the lives of those in the house. It began with a shadow. One evening, Zhang was cleaning the kitchen when she caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. A dark shape moved quickly past the doorway. At first, She assumed it was Philip or Joe, but when she called out to them, there was no answer. She checked the living room and the hallway, but no one was there. The rest of the family was upstairs, and they hadn't come downstairs at all. Shaken, Zhang tried to convince herself that it was just a trick of the light or her imagination. But that night, the same shadow appeared again this time. It was seen by both Philip and Diane. It wasn't long before all the members of the Pritchard family had witnessed the dark figure moving silently through the house. The figure was always fleeting, disappearing just as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to fill the family with dread. Then, the black monk fully revealed himself. One night, as Diane was preparing for bed, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air in her room became stifling, and the familiar cold chill set in. She turned to leave the room, but before she could reach the door, she froze in terror. Standing in the corner, partially obscured by the shadows, was a tall hooded figure dressed in black robes. His face was hidden, but Diane could feel his gaze fixed on her. She stood frozen, unable to move or cry out. After what felt like an eternity, the figure vanished, leaving Diane trembling and gasping for breath. When she finally managed to scream, her parents rushed into the room. Diane sobbed as she explained what she had seen, and the fear in her eyes left no doubt in their minds that she had truly encountered something terrifying. From that point on, the black monk became a regular presence in the house. The family often saw him lurking in the hallway, at the top of the stairs, or standing in the shadows of a room. He never spoke, but his appearance always preceded the most violent outbursts of poltergeist activity. The family soon realized that whenever they saw the monk, something terrible was about to happen. One of the most terrifying events occurred one evening while the family was gathered in the living room. Suddenly, without warning, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. As Joe fumbled to find a flashlight, they all heard a loud, menacing thump coming from the hallway. The noise grew louder and closer, like heavy footsteps stomping toward the room. The family huddled together in fear, listening to the footsteps as they stopped just outside the door. And then, with a violent crash, the door to the living room flew open. The shadowy figure of the black monk stood in the doorway, looming over them. Objects around the room began to rattle and shake, and the temperature dropped dramatically. The family sat frozen in place, watching in horror as the monk slowly disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, leaving the house in complete silence. Despite the terror, the family tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Joe still went to work, Zhang still cared for the home, and Philip and Diane attended school. But the strain of living in a haunted house was taking its toll. Diane, in particular, became withdrawn and anxious. The attacks on her became more frequent and more violent. On several occasions, she was physically pushed or pulled by an unseen force, leaving bruises and scratches on her arms and legs. One of the most shocking events occurred when Diane was walking up the staircase. Suddenly, an invisible force grabbed her by the throat and lifted her several feet off the ground. Gasping for air, she struggled to free herself, but the grip only tightened. Her family, hearing her desperate cries, rushed to the staircase and watched in horror as Diane was suspended in midair, her legs kicking frantically. Joe grabbed her, and as soon as he made contact, she dropped to the floor, gasping and sobbing. It was clear that the poltergeist had a particular fixation on Diane, and the family feared for her safety. They tried everything they could think of to protect her. Zhang sprinkled holy water around the house, and they even brought in a medium who claimed to have experience dealing with violent spirits, but nothing seemed to work. The black monk's presence only grew stronger, and the attacks on Diane became more brutal. As word of the haunting spread, it attracted the attention of the media and paranormal investigators. Journalists flocked to Pontefract to cover the story, and their reports brought a mixture of skepticism and fascination from the public. Some dismissed the haunting as a hoax, believing that the family was seeking attention or playing pranks. Others, however, were convinced that the Pritchards were dealing with something very real and very dangerous. The investigators who visited the house came with various tools, cameras, recording devices, and electromagnetic field detectors. Many hoped to capture evidence of the supernatural forces at play. While not all were successful, some investigators left the house convinced that something otherworldly was occurring. Several reported witnessing objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut without cause, and cold spots that could not be explained by drafts or faulty heating systems. One investigator, while setting up a camera on the staircase, claimed to have seen the figure of the black monk at the top of the stairs. He described the monk as a tall, dark figure wearing long robes, his face hidden beneath a hood. The investigator said that as soon as the figure appeared, the room grew deathly cold, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. The monk vanished just as quickly as he had appeared, leaving the investigators shaken and convinced that the Pritchards were telling the truth. Despite the growing attention, the haunting showed no signs of stopping. The black monk continued to terrorize the family, particularly Diane. By now, the once happy home had become a place of fear and despair. The Pritchards felt trapped, unable to escape the malevolent force that had taken over their lives. The haunting had reached its peak, and the Pritchard family was left to wonder how much more they could endure. The Black Monk of Pontefract had made his presence known in the most terrifying way, and the family's nightmare seemed far from over. After months of living under constant attack, the Pritchard family began to lose hope that they would ever be free from the torment of the Black Monk. Each day brought new horrors, and the relentless nature of the poltergeist's activities was wearing them down physically, emotionally, and mentally. The once vibrant and lively home had become a place of deep fear and anxiety, a house where every corner held the possibility of danger. The family's well-being was unraveling as the haunting entered a terrifying new phase. Zhang, who had always been the pillar of strength for the family, was now struggling to keep herself together. The stress of living with the constant supernatural activity was taking its toll on her health. She began losing sleep, staying awake through the night, listening for the familiar sounds of footsteps or watching for the sudden movement of furniture. Her face grew pale, her eyes dark with exhaustion. Even in the daylight, Zhang felt no relief. She became haunted by the feeling that she was always being watched, as if the Black Monk's presence followed her no matter where she went. Zhou, too, was suffering. While he had initially dismissed the haunting as nothing more than superstition, the events he had witnessed over the past months had shaken his resolve. As the head of the family, he felt responsible for protecting his wife and children, but the unseen entity terrorizing their home was beyond his control. No amount of logic or rational thought could explain what was happening in their house, and Joe, a man of practical solutions, found himself helpless. His frustration grew as each attempt to rid the house of the Black Monk only seemed to make things worse. He began avoiding home as much as possible, staying late at work or finding reasons to run errands to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The children, Philip and Diane, were perhaps the most deeply affected by the haunting. Philip, once a quiet and studious boy, had become distant and withdrawn. The events at 30 East Drive had stolen the innocence of his youth, replacing it with fear and anxiety. He no longer felt safe in his own home, and the constant activity had left him on edge. He tried to focus on schoolwork and friends, but the shadow of the Black Monk loomed over every aspect of his life. Philip no longer invited friends over, afraid of what they might witness, and he often stayed away from home, just as his father did. Diane, however, remained the primary focus of the Black Monk's attacks. The entity seemed to take a particular interest in her, and the intensity of the haunting grew even more terrifying when she was present. At night, Diane's bed would shake violently, waking her in the early hours of the morning. She would often wake up to find her blankets ripped away or the furniture in her room moved to impossible angles. On one occasion, Diane awoke to find herself being dragged out of bed by an invisible force, her screams echoing through the house as her parents rushed to her side. The bruises and scratches on her body were constant reminders of the malevolent force that tormented her. Diane had once been a spirited and outgoing girl, but the months of terror had broken her. She became increasingly isolated, fearful of going to sleep and afraid to be alone in any room of the house. Her friends, noticing the changes in her demeanor, slowly drifted away, unsure of how to help her and wary of the rumors about her haunted home. Diane was left feeling trapped and alone, unable to escape the darkness that seemed to cling to her every moment. By now, the house had become a living nightmare. The Black Monk's appearances were frequent and aggressive, no longer confined to fleeting glimpses in darkened rooms. The figure would manifest fully in front of the family, standing motionless at the top of the stairs or in the corners of rooms, watching them with unseen eyes. His presence always carried with it a deep, unnatural cold that chilled the air and filled the family with dread. The Pritchards began to avoid certain parts of the house altogether, particularly the staircase where the Black Monk's activity was strongest. The once comforting routine of family life had completely unraveled. Meals were eaten in tense silence, and conversations were short, focused only on the necessary. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating, the sense of dread and fear growing stronger with each passing day. Even the small relief the family had once found in daylight had faded. The Black Monk's presence was no longer confined to the night. It now manifested at any hour. Zhang would often hear footsteps in the hallway during the day, or find objects mysteriously moved even when she was home alone. As the haunting intensified, Zhang sought help once more. She reached out to more paranormal investigators, hoping that anyone, could provide answers or a solution. One investigator, known for his experience in dealing with violent hauntings, arrived at 30 East Drive with a team of assistants and a collection of advanced equipment. They set up cameras throughout the house, aiming to capture proof of the Black Monk's presence. Microphones were placed in every room, designed to pick up the slightest sound of ghostly activity. For the first few hours, the house was eerily quiet. The investigators recorded little more than the normal creaks and groans of an old home. But as the night wore on, the mood shifted. Cold spots began to form in the rooms, moving from one location to another, impossible to explain. The cameras captured strange, unexplained shadows moving across the walls, and the microphones picked up faint, disembodied voices. But the most disturbing event occurred when one of the investigators was alone in Diane's room, setting up additional equipment. As he stood by the window, checking the camera's angle, he felt a sudden, powerful push from behind. He stumbled forward, barely catching himself before crashing into the dresser. He turned quickly, expecting to see one of his colleagues playing a prank, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The investigator, pale and shaken, left the room immediately, convinced that whatever haunted the house was not something to be trifled with. Despite the physical evidence they gathered, the investigators, like so many before them, could offer no real solution to the Pritchards. The Black Monk remained as strong as ever, seemingly immune to any attempts to remove him from the house. The team left with their findings, but the family was once again left to face the haunting alone. As the haunting reached its darkest point, the family's resilience was pushed to the breaking point. Zhang, once the backbone of the household, now openly considered leaving the house for good. But moving wasn't an easy option. Financially, the family was tied to the house, and they feared that the Black Monk might follow them wherever they went. Joe, too, considered leaving, but the practicalities of such a move weighed heavily on him. Despite the horrors they had endured, the family was trapped in 30 East Drive, held hostage by forces they could not understand or control. The darkness in the house was palpable, and the once happy family was crumbling under the weight of the Black Monk's presence. With nowhere else to turn and no end in sight, the Pritchards were left to face the terrifying reality that their home was no longer their own. The malevolent spirit of the Black Monk had claimed it, and they were living at the mercy of his relentless and cruel attacks. As the Pritchard family entered the final months of their ordeal, it seemed that the Black Monk's grip on their home had reached a terrifying climax. Every day brought new attacks, and the once hopeful efforts to rid the house of the malevolent spirit had all but ceased. The family was exhausted, emotionally, physically, and mentally. Though they had considered leaving, fear of the unknown and financial constraints kept them locked within the haunted walls of 30 East Drive. But now, the haunting would take an even more sinister turn, leading to an event that would mark the darkest point in their battle against the entity. One late autumn evening, the air in the house felt particularly heavy, as if something monumental was about to happen. Zhang noticed it first, a silence that was far too eerie, as if the house itself was holding its breath. There were no familiar creaks or footsteps, no cold spots or rattling objects. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like the Black Monk had gone, but the family had lived through too many horrors to believe that so easily. Something was coming. Diane, who had been the primary target of the attacks, was upstairs in her bedroom when she heard a faint rhythmic tapping. At first, she tried to ignore it, knowing that responding to any odd sound could make things worse. But as the tapping grew louder, it became impossible to dismiss. She sat up in bed, staring at the far wall where the noise seemed to be originating. Then, without warning, the bed began to shake violently. This was something she had experienced before, but the force was far stronger now. Her heart raced as the bed lifted slightly off the floor, and Diane screamed for her parents. Zhang and Joe rushed up the stairs, finding Diane huddled in the corner of her room, trembling and pale. The bed had been overturned, and the furniture in the room was scattered haphazardly. Before they could comfort her, the temperature in the room dropped rapidly. They all felt it, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to freeze them in place. And then, out of the shadows, he appeared. The Black Monk stood at the foot of the overturned bed, his dark hooded figure looming over the room. This was no fleeting glimpse. His presence was more solid, more real than ever before. Zhang gasped, clutching Joe's arm, her fear overwhelming her. The figure moved slowly, silently, as if gliding across the floor. Diane could feel his gaze, though his face remained obscured beneath the hood. Her body tensed, every instinct telling her to run, but she couldn't move. Then, with a sudden and terrifying speed, the entity lunged toward Diane. She felt an invisible force grip her throat, and before anyone could react, she was lifted into the air. Zhang screamed as Diane's body was pinned against the wall, her feet dangling several inches above the floor. Joe, panicked, ran toward her, but as soon as he got close, the air around Diane seemed to ripple with a dark energy, and he was thrown back across the room. Zhang desperately tried to reach Diane, but her own body felt heavy and unresponsive, as if something was holding her back. Diane's eyes were wide with terror as she struggled to breathe, clawing at her neck as though trying to pry off invisible hands. The Black Monk watched from the shadows, his presence thick in the air, exuding a sense of cruel satisfaction. It was at that moment that something shifted. Diane's body dropped to the floor, gasping for air as the grip on her throat released. The Black Monk remained in the room, his figure still as stone, but the oppressive force had lifted just enough for the family to regain some control. Zhang and Joe rushed to Diane's side, pulling her away from the wall. Though terrified, they knew they had to act fast. This could no longer be ignored. They needed help, and they needed it immediately. Desperate, Joe called a local priest, hoping for some form of divine intervention. The priest, Father Lyons, had heard of the hauntings at 30 East Drive, though he had been hesitant to get involved. But hearing the panic in Joe's voice, he agreed to come at once. By the time he arrived, the house felt like a powder keg ready to explode. The atmosphere was charged with a malevolent energy that even Father Lyons could sense the moment he crossed the threshold. Father Lyons came prepared with holy water, a Bible, and a deep sense of faith. As he entered the house, he immediately felt the presence of something dark and unholy. The temperature dropped around him, and the familiar tapping sound began once more, growing louder as he moved through the house. He went directly to Diane's room, where the most violent activity had occurred. The family gathered behind him, watching nervously as Father Lyons stood in the center of the room. He began to pray, sprinkling holy water along the walls and over the bed, asking for protection and deliverance from the evil that plagued the home. As his voice rose in strength, the room seemed to react violently. Objects flew off shelves, smashing against the walls. The bed frame rattled and creaked, as if something was trying to break it apart. And Father Lyons stood firm, his prayers unwavering. Suddenly, the figure of the black monk materialized in the corner of the room. His presence was undeniable, a shadow that moved with a purpose. He seemed agitated, angry at the intrusion. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the lights flickered wildly. Father Lyons continued his prayer, louder now, his words commanding the spirit to leave the house and never return. The black monk moved forward, his dark form towering over Father Lyons, as if challenging him. For a moment, the air in the room became thick and oppressive, the tension unbearable. But Father Lyons did not falter. He threw holy water in the direction of the black monk, his voice ringing out with authority. The entity recoiled, its form flickering as if caught between two worlds. The energy in the room reached a fever pitch, with objects crashing around them, the walls shaking as if the house itself was being torn apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The black monk vanished, his shadowy figure dissolving into nothingness. The temperature began to rise, and the room fell silent. The house, for the first time in months, felt still. The Pritchard family stood in stunned silence, barely able to believe that it was over. Father Lyons lowered his Bible, his face pale but calm. He assured them that the entity had been driven out, but he warned them that such evil forces never fully disappear. Vigilance, he said, was key. In the days that followed, the house remained quiet. The Pritchards, though still wary, began to reclaim their lives. Diane slowly recovered from the trauma of her ordeal, and Zhang found herself able to sleep through the night once more. Joe, ever the skeptic, cautiously allowed himself to believe that the worst was behind them. Though the family would never forget the terror they had endured, they were grateful for the peace that had finally come to their home. The Black Monk of Pontefract had retreated into the shadows, his presence lingering in the history of 30 East Drive, but no longer controlling the lives of the Pritchards. Whether he was truly gone or simply waiting, no one could say for certain. But for now, the family could breathe again, thankful to have survived the darkest chapter of their lives. Anneliese Michel grew up in a small Bavarian village in post-war Germany, surrounded by the strong influence of the Catholic Church. From an early age, her life revolved around prayer, religious education, and a deep sense of devotion. Her parents, devout Catholics, believed that faith was the foundation of a moral life, and Anneliese embraced their teachings wholeheartedly. However, beneath the surface of this pious upbringing was a persistent pressure to achieve spiritual perfection, a burden she would carry throughout her short life. By the time she reached her teenage years, Anneliese felt an overwhelming sense of duty to live righteously. She avoided anything that might be considered sinful and constantly worried that her thoughts or actions might offend God. This need to be good was not just about faith. It became a source of intense anxiety. The line between religious devotion and fear of divine punishment grew thinner with each passing day. She confessed her sins frequently, sometimes obsessing over minor mistakes, such as missing a prayer or feeling envy toward a friend. To her, these slip-ups felt like betrayals, not just to God, but to herself. Her struggles with self-worth deepened when, at the age of 16, she experienced her first medical episode. During school, she suddenly lost control of her body, collapsing in a fit of convulsions. Confused and frightened, Annalise woke up in the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder known to cause seizures, memory lapses, and hallucinations. Although the doctors assured her that medication would manage her symptoms, Annalise sensed that her suffering had a deeper meaning. Why, she wondered, was she being afflicted this way? Had she somehow failed God? Despite taking prescribed anti-seizure medication, her symptoms persisted. Annalise began to experience terrifying visual disturbances, shadowy figures that would appear in her bedroom, whispering cruel words she couldn't ignore. Sometimes, these hallucinations made her question if the people around her were really there. These experiences were deeply unsettling, leaving her exhausted and anxious. She isolated herself, withdrawing from social activities, fearful of judgment and embarrassment. Her parents, initially hopeful that treatment would improve her condition, grew increasingly concerned. Her inner turmoil also led to unsettling behaviors. At first, she simply punished herself for perceived failings, praying for hours without rest, or kneeling on hard surfaces until her knees were bruised. However, as her mental state deteriorated, these behaviors grew more extreme. She would wake up in the middle of the night and intentionally sleep on the cold floor, believing it was a form of penance. Other times, she deprived herself of basic comforts, like food and warmth, convinced that she needed to suffer to purify her soul. As the seizures and hallucinations continued, Annelise's sense of identity became increasingly fragmented. She began questioning if she was cursed or if an evil presence had taken root within her. The medical explanations offered little comfort. How could something as clinical as a brain disorder account for the overwhelming darkness that haunted her mind? To Annalise, her suffering felt like a spiritual battle, a test from God that she had to endure, no matter the cost. As Annalise entered adulthood, her mental and physical state deteriorated rapidly. The seizures became more frequent, and no combination of medications seemed to control them. But what disturbed her most were the terrifying visions and voices that invaded her mind. These were not just hallucinations. She believed they carried a message, one that filled her with fear. At first, it was the faint sound of whispers, but soon they grew louder and more hostile. The voices accused her of being unworthy, insisting she was beyond redemption. They told her she had failed, that her soul was lost. The once devout girl, who had cherished her faith, began to experience deep confusion. Praying, which had once given her comfort, now seemed impossible. The voices mocked her when she tried, telling her that God no longer listened. She avoided church, even tearing up prayer cards and damaging crucifixes in frustration. It was as if everything sacred that had once anchored her life now felt distant and unreachable. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. In moments of panic, she would lash out, not knowing how to cope with the overpowering emotions inside her. She withdrew from her family, spending long hours alone in her room, unable to find peace. Sometimes she would pace back and forth or sit for hours in silence, lost in the storm of thoughts that never seemed to quiet. What frightened her most was the sense that she no longer had control over herself. Her family tried their best to help, but the changes in Annalise were overwhelming. She refused to eat regular meals, not because of a lack of hunger, but because she believed that depriving herself was the only way to cleanse her spirit. The voices told her that she did not deserve comfort or nourishment. She began to experience strange impulses, behaviors she couldn't explain but felt compelled to follow. She might suddenly throw herself to the ground, feeling as though her body was not her own to command. Night after night, her sleep was interrupted by vivid nightmares of grotesque creatures and apocalyptic visions. Some nights she awoke in tears, convinced that her prayers had damned her instead of saved her. Other times she felt a compulsion to make herself physically uncomfortable, lying on the cold floor despite the warmth of her bed, or kneeling for hours until her legs trembled. These acts were not intended to harm, but felt like punishment she deserved. She hoped that, through suffering, she could find forgiveness for whatever unseen sin haunted her. The hallucinations worsened over time. Sometimes she saw figures she described as demons' twisted shapes with burning eyes lurking in the corners of her vision. She would scream and cry out to her parents, terrified by what she believed were real entities surrounding her. Her mother would try to comfort her, but nothing seemed to ease the fear. Even when the apparitions disappeared, their presence lingered in Annelise's mind. She believed these beings wanted to destroy her from within, and no amount of medical treatment could stop them. Doctors urged the family to remain patient, insisting that her symptoms were caused by her epilepsy and possibly a developing mental illness. Yet the Michel family was losing hope. Every new medication seemed to come with side effects that worsened Annelise's suffering, exhaustion, mood swings, and feelings of despair. They began to suspect that what tormented their daughter went beyond science's understanding. Meanwhile, Annelise herself grew more convinced that her affliction was not a medical problem, but a spiritual one. She told her parents that the medications were useless because she was not sick in the way the doctors thought. Something evil, she believed, had taken root inside her, and only faith could drive it out. She spoke of hearing names in her mind, figures she identified as Judas, Nero, and others condemned in Christian tradition. These presences taunted her, making her believe she was trapped in a battle for her soul. By the time Annelise's condition reached its breaking point, the Michel family had exhausted every medical option available to them. Each visit to a neurologist or psychiatrist ended with a prescription for new medications, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, but nothing relieved Annelise's torment. As weeks turned into months, her parents began to believe that something far beyond medicine was plaguing their daughter. They were devout Catholics, and it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the possibility that Annelise's suffering was spiritual, not merely medical. Annelise, too, had abandoned hope in medical explanations. She insisted that what controlled her wasn't a disease, but a dark force. Her strange behavior and outbursts now carried a sinister weight. She claimed that malevolent beings inhabited her, whispering blasphemies and urging her to reject everything good in her life. The voices were relentless, taunting her and telling her she was destined for ruin. At times, she felt she couldn't even pray because the words became twisted in her mouth, as if the darkness within her was interfering. Her family sought the advice of local priests, hoping that the church could offer the help that doctors could not. However, the priests were cautious. Official exorcisms were rare and required proof that the afflicted person's condition could not be explained by illness alone. The priests advised the Michels to continue with medical treatment, but Annelise's worsening state left them feeling helpless. Each passing day revealed new signs of her struggle. She would refuse meals for extended periods, explaining that it was part of a personal penance, or spend hours staring at religious objects, visibly distressed as if in conflict with herself. Despite these alarming signs, most of the clergy remained hesitant. However, Father Ernst Alt, a local priest, became deeply concerned about Annelise's condition. He believed her suffering was unlike anything he had encountered before. After meeting with Annelise, he noted the strange shifts in her personality moments where she seemed possessed by an overwhelming rage, only to collapse moments later, apologizing and sobbing uncontrollably. Father out, but these episodes were more than medical symptoms. He suspected that something spiritual was taking hold of her. The priest's belief was further cemented by Annelise's growing resistance to sacred items. On several occasions, she recoiled from crucifixes as if in pain and was unable to enter chapels, insisting that an unseen force was blocking her. Father Out urged the family to pursue an exorcism, believing that it was the only way to save her. He explained that exorcisms were not quick fixes. They were difficult rituals that required time, endurance, and faith from everyone involved. But if her condition truly stemmed from a spiritual affliction, the ritual was their only option. To perform the rite, however, they needed formal permission from the diocese. Father Out, along with another priest, Father Arnold Renz, documented Annelise's worsening symptoms and sent a request to Bishop Joseph Stangl. After reviewing the case, the bishop granted approval for the ritual romanum, the official rite of exorcism. The priests were instructed to follow strict guidelines, ensuring the ritual was performed with care and precision. Annelise welcomed the news of the exorcism. By this point, she was utterly convinced that she was being consumed by something evil, and she saw the ritual as her only hope for salvation. She told her parents that the demons inside her claimed they would never let her go, but she believed that through suffering, she could defeat them. Annelise began to view her suffering not just as punishment, but as a form of sacrifice. She believed that her trials could help cleanse others, perhaps even atone for the sins of strangers she had never met. Her family was equally desperate for a solution, no matter how difficult it might be. They believed that the exorcism would be a path to healing, though none of them could have predicted the toll it would take. Annelise's condition had already pushed them to the edge emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Yet, the promise of deliverance gave them a glimmer of hope that perhaps, at long last, their daughter could be freed from the torment that had consumed her life. But with that hope came fear. They knew the ritual would be grueling, and they worried about what it would do to Annelise's fragile body. The priest warned them that the exorcism might provoke violent episodes and that there were no guarantees of success. But for the Michels, this was their final option. Medical treatments had failed, and time was slipping away. All they could do now was trust in the power of their faith and in Annelise's belief that salvation was worth any price. In the fall of 1975, the first exorcism session began inside the Michel family's modest home. The room, dimly lit by candles and filled with religious artifacts, carried the quiet heaviness of fear and hope. Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt led the ceremony, reciting prayers from the ritual Romanum, the ancient text used to expel evil spirits. The atmosphere was tense, every word of the prayer heavy with expectation. Annelise sat in the middle of the room, her hands trembling in her lap, waiting for the first confrontation with whatever force held her captive. From the very beginning, the sessions were harrowing. As the priest prayed over her, Annelise's demeanor shifted rapidly. At times, she appeared peaceful, mouthing along with familiar prayers. But soon after, her voice would change, becoming low, hoarse, and full of malice. She would thrash violently in her chair, growling and shouting words she claimed weren't her own. It was as though multiple personalities had taken control, each one angry and defiant. She identified these voices as belonging to notorious figures like Judas and even darker beings, insisting that they lived within her and refused to leave. The exorcisms were physically and emotionally draining, not only for Annelise, but for everyone involved. The priests and her parents often had to restrain her when she would throw herself onto the floor or bang her head against walls, driven by impulses she couldn't explain. Despite their efforts, Annelise's physical condition began to deteriorate. Her body, already fragile from the months of self-denial, grew weaker with each passing session. She was unable to keep down food, convinced by the voices that she must reject earthly nourishment to complete her mission. The priest tried to encourage her to eat, but Annalise refused, believing that her suffering was necessary for salvation. Each exorcism session lasted for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. Her parents were horrified by what they witnessed. Annalise's voice shifting into guttural tones that didn't sound human, her body convulsing uncontrollably, and her skin breaking out in unexplained marks and bruises. Yet there were brief moments of lucidity when she would beg her family to continue the ritual, insisting that she could feel the darkness being forced to the surface. Her parents clung to these moments, believing that Annalise's suffering was bringing her closer to freedom. They prayed alongside the priests, sometimes holding her hands as she trembled, and whispered that she could feel herself slipping away. To them, each session, no matter how excruciating, was a step closer to reclaiming their daughter from the grip of evil. Over the course of 10 months, more than 60 exorcism sessions were performed. Annalise's condition worsened with each one. She rarely slept, her nights filled with haunting visions that left her gasping for breath. During the day, she would pace the house or sit silently, lost in her thoughts, her once bright personality reduced to a shadow of its former self. As the rituals dragged on, the demons seemed to resist with greater intensity. Annalise would scream for hours, her voice cracking from exhaustion. She would mock the priests, taunting them with obscene language, daring them to continue. The priests remained resolute, believing that the intensity of her resistance was a sign that the exorcism was working. They prayed louder, reciting the sacred words over and over, hoping to wear down whatever force held her captive. The toll on Annalise's body was undeniable. She became severely underweight, her limbs weak and trembling from exhaustion. Her knees were swollen and bruised from hours spent kneeling in prayer, her voice hoarse from constant screaming. Yet she refused to stop. She believed that her suffering was part of a larger plan, that by enduring these trials, she was helping to save others from spiritual harm. To Annalise, this was no longer just about her freedom. It was a sacrifice for a higher purpose. Despite her family's pleas for rest, Annalise insisted on continuing the exorcisms. She begged her parents not to abandon the ritual, even though they could see her body was slowly giving out. Her mother often cried during the sessions, watching helplessly as her daughter endured what seemed like unbearable pain. But Annalise would always reassure her, saying that it would all be over soon, that she would be free, even if it meant surrendering everything she had left. The priests, too, struggled with the emotional weight of the situation. Father Renz and Father Out spent countless hours in prayer, asking for strength to continue. They knew that Annalise's condition was worsening, but they believed that abandoning the ritual would be tantamount to giving in to the forces they were fighting. The line between faith and desperation blurred, and the priests pressed forward, hoping that each session would finally bring the deliverance they sought. Toward the end of the exorcisms, Annalise's moments of clarity became fewer and far between. Her speech slowed, her movements were weak and uncoordinated, and her eyes, once bright with determination, grew distant. Yet she never expressed regret for what she had endured. In her rare, lucid moments, she whispered to her parents and the priests that she was ready for the end, whatever that might mean. By June 1976, Annalise Michel's body was ravaged from months of relentless exorcisms and physical exhaustion. Her frame was skeletal, her movements slow and unsteady. Yet, despite her weakened state, she clung to a fierce belief that the torment she endured had a higher purpose. Every breath she took felt like a battle, but Annalise was certain that she was on the verge of liberation, that through suffering, she could achieve a form of spiritual victory. Her parents were filled with both hope and dread. They wanted to believe that the end was near, that their daughter would finally be free from the torment that had consumed her for years. But they also saw the toll it had taken, Annalise could no longer walk without assistance, and speaking was a struggle. Still, whenever she had moments of lucidity, she insisted that the exorcisms continue. "I have to keep going," she whispered to her mother one night, her voice barely audible. "I'm almost there." The exorcism sessions became increasingly urgent as the priests and her family sensed that they were running out of time. During one of the final rituals, Annelise's body convulsed violently, her face twisted in pain. Yet, between these intense moments, she would sometimes flash a strange, serene smile, telling those around her that she could feel the darkness weakening. It was as if she believed that each moment of agony brought her closer to a divine release. On June 30th, 1976, the final exorcism session took place. Annalise was too weak to kneel, so she lay on a mattress placed on the floor. Her parents, desperate and exhausted, held her hands, hoping against hope that this would be the moment of deliverance. Father Renz and Father Alt recited the exorcism prayers with steady determination, their voices filling the room with sacred verses. Annelise's breathing was shallow, but she forced herself to respond to the prayers, whispering "yes" and "please stay with me" whenever she had the strength. Throughout the session, Annelise's expressions alternated between anguish and moments of strange peace. At one point, she looked into her mother's eyes and murmured, "Mother, I'm afraid." Her mother stroked her hair, fighting back tears, assuring Annalise that she was not alone. They all prayed that this would be the final battle, that the forces tormenting her would release their grip at last. Toward the end of the ritual, Annelise's voice softened, and she said something that haunted those present for years to come. "Please, don't give up on me." But as the hours dragged on, her strength gave out. The session ended without the sense of triumph they had hoped for, and Annalise, too weak to speak, closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. The following morning, on July 1st, 1976, Annalise Michel passed away quietly in her home. Her parents discovered her lifeless body and, in their grief, called the priests to inform them of her passing. Annelise's frail frame, reduced to just over 60 pounds, was a tragic testament to the suffering she had endured. For her family and the priests, the overwhelming question was whether her death was a spiritual victory or an unbearable loss. The tragedy did not end with Annelise's passing. In the months that followed, the case drew public attention, leading to an investigation that scrutinized the actions of her parents and the priests. Authorities questioned whether Annelise's death could have been prevented had medical intervention been prioritized over religious rituals. Her parents and the priests were charged with negligent homicide, sparking a controversial trial that captivated the nation and raised difficult questions about the intersection of faith and mental health. During the trial, Annelise's parents defended their decision, insisting that they had followed their daughter's wishes and had acted out of love and desperation. They described Annalise as a willing participant in the exorcisms, someone who truly believed that her suffering had meaning. The priests, too, stood by their actions, explaining that they had exhausted every other option and that Annalise herself had pleaded for the rituals to continue. Medical experts testified that Annelise's condition was likely the result of untreated epilepsy and psychosis, worsened by the extreme stress of the exorcisms. But for those closest to Annalise, the answer was more complicated. They believed that Annelise's suffering could not be fully explained by medical terms, that something deeper had taken place, something beyond human understanding. In the end, the priests and Annelise's parents were found guilty of negligent homicide but received suspended sentences, as the court acknowledged that they had acted out of a misguided sense of care and faith. The verdict left many unresolved questions. Was Annalise a victim of untreated illness, or did she truly endure a spiritual trial? And if her suffering was real, did it accomplish the redemption she had hoped for? Annelies's story remains both a cautionary tale and a source of reflection on the complexities of faith, mental health, and the human need for meaning. To this day, some view her as a tragic figure who was failed by the systems meant to help her, while others believe that she experienced a spiritual battle that few can understand. In the years following her death, her grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the possibility of miracles. Visitors left flowers, prayers, and messages, hoping that, in some way, Annelies's suffering had opened a path to healing. But for her family and the priests who had stood by her, the story was one of profound loss, a reminder that sometimes the search for salvation can lead to unimaginable sacrifice. In the late 1930s, as the world teetered on the brink of war, the quiet English countryside in Suffolk held secrets long buried beneath the earth. The land, rolling and green, had a gentle way of keeping its past concealed. But for Edith Pretty, the owner of Sutton Hoo Estate, the ancient burial mounds on her property stirred her curiosity. Edith was a wealthy widow in her 50s, and despite her age, she possessed an adventurous spirit. She had always been fascinated by history and archaeology. After years of living on the estate and gazing at the mounds, she began to wonder what lay beneath them. Her interest grew after hearing local legends that these mounds might hide long-lost treasures, perhaps even the resting place of kings. It was the summer of 1938 when Edith finally decided to act. She had been reading articles on recent archaeological digs and, inspired, she contacted the local Ipswich Museum for advice. They recommended Basil Brown, a self-taught archaeologist with a passion for unearthing history. Though not formally trained, Brown had a deep knowledge of the land and a reputation for careful, thorough work. Edith invited him to the estate, and soon an agreement was made to begin exploring the mysterious mounds. Basil Brown was not a man of wealth or high education, but he possessed a talent that few others did a sense of the land. He had an ability to read the earth and understand its secrets. When he first set foot on Sutton Hoo, he was struck by the sheer size of the mounds. Some were as tall as trees, looming over the landscape like sentinels guarding something precious. The excavation began in earnest, but no one could have imagined what they were about to uncover. The first few days were slow. Basil and his small team of laborers worked carefully, mindful not to damage anything. They had no idea what lay beneath, whether it would be an empty mound or something extraordinary. At first, the dig revealed little more than small fragments of iron and decayed wood, signs that the mound had been disturbed before. Yet Basil remained optimistic. He knew that patience was key. As the team continued to remove layers of earth, something remarkable began to take shape, the outline of a ship. Brown could hardly believe his eyes. The sandy soil had preserved an impression of a ship, large enough to befit royalty. The wood had long since decayed, leaving only a ghostly imprint, but the form of the ship was unmistakable. It stretched nearly 90 feet long, a size that suggested this was no ordinary burial. This was something far grander. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Edith Pretty herself came to the site daily, watching with excitement as the ancient vessel emerged from the soil. She had hoped for something significant, but the magnitude of what was being uncovered exceeded her wildest dreams. The ship's structure, though fragile and partially destroyed by time, was evidence of a culture that had mastery over the sea. But it wasn't just the size of the ship that astonished the team. As they dug deeper, they realized that the vessel had been used as a burial ship, likely for someone of great importance. The thought lingered. Could this be the resting place of a long-forgotten king? Excitement turned to trepidation as the team carefully uncovered more of the ship. The scale of the task ahead became clearer. This was not a simple dig. It was a mission to recover a piece of history so old that its very existence had been forgotten. Every move had to be precise, every piece of earth removed with care. Basil Brown knew the significance of what they had found, but he also understood the risks. An excavation of this scale had never been attempted before in England, at least not with such a delicate site. The ship was a marvel, but it was fragile. Any mistake could destroy what little remained. As more of the ship was revealed, it became clear that this was not an isolated find. The ship was part of a much larger burial complex, perhaps one used by an elite group of people warriors, leaders, and rulers. The ship had been placed in the earth with great care, loaded with treasures meant to accompany its occupant into the afterlife. By the end of the summer, the excavation had gained attention beyond Suffolk. Archaeologists from across Britain began to take notice. The press, too, caught wind of the discovery. Headlines soon spoke of Britain's greatest find, and speculation ran wild about the identity of the person buried within the ship. Some believed it could be a legendary king or warrior, a figure whose story had been lost to time. Despite the growing attention, Edith Pretty remained modest about her role in the discovery. She had simply acted on a hunch, following her curiosity. But as the ship continued to reveal its secrets, it became clear that her decision to explore the mounds was one that would reshape the understanding of England's ancient history. The discovery of the ship set the stage for a much larger adventure, one that would continue to unfold in the months and years to come. For now, though, the ship lay beneath the soil, waiting for its full story to be told. As the sun rose over the fields of Suffolk in the summer of 1939, a small team of workers arrived at Sutton Hoo, eager to continue their excavation of what was shaping up to be one of the most remarkable finds in British history. Basil Brown, the archaeologist leading the dig, had uncovered the outline of an ancient ship. But what lay beneath was still a mystery. The real work was only just beginning. The excavation site, now buzzing with activity, was far from a glamorous operation. With no heavy machinery and only simple tools like shovels, trowels, and brushes, the work was slow, meticulous, and physically demanding. Each layer of soil had to be removed carefully to avoid disturbing any fragile artifacts that might lie beneath the surface. Time was not on their side, as the threat of war loomed over Europe, adding urgency to their efforts. A small team of workers, mostly local laborers, had little formal training in archaeology, but they followed his instructions diligently. He had a deep respect for the past, and he knew that any mistake, no matter how small, could erase vital clues to understanding the burial. The ship they had uncovered was not made of iron or stone. It had once been a grand wooden vessel. Over the centuries, the wood had decayed, leaving only the impression of the ship in the soil. This meant that the entire outline of the ship was incredibly delicate, requiring precision to uncover it without causing damage. As they dug deeper, the true size of the ship became more apparent. Nearly 90 feet long, it was the kind of ship that could only have belonged to someone of great importance. It wasn't just its size that amazed the team. It was the craftsmanship. The lines of the ship's hull were graceful, curving elegantly through the earth, a testament to the shipbuilders who had constructed it more than 1,000 years earlier. Brown's excitement grew as the excavation progressed, but so did his sense of responsibility. The discovery of the ship was already monumental, but he knew there had to be more. Anglo-Saxon burial customs suggested that whoever was buried here had been laid to rest with treasures fit for a king. The ship, it seemed, was just the beginning. As the days passed, the team began to uncover a wealth of small finds, pieces of iron, fragments of pottery, and even a few rusted nails that hinted at the ship's construction. These items were important, but they were not the treasures the team had hoped to find. Still, Basil remained patient. He knew that the most valuable artifacts were likely still hidden deeper within the burial chamber, and he was determined to reach them. The dig became more challenging as they approached the center of the ship, where the burial chamber was believed to be. The earth here was heavier, and the signs of earlier disturbances, likely grave robbers from centuries past, became more evident. Some parts of the ship had been damaged, either by the passage of time or by human hands, but there were still large sections of the vessel that remained untouched. One day, as the team carefully removed soil from the center of the ship, they uncovered something extraordinary: a large wooden structure that had once formed the burial chamber. Though the wood itself had long since decayed, the impression it left behind was unmistakable. The chamber was large enough to hold not only a body, but also the treasures that would have accompanied it. Basil Brown was struck by the enormity of what they had found. This wasn't just a ship burial, it was a royal tomb. The chamber was situated in the very heart of the ship, a place of honor reserved for someone of the highest status. Though the chamber had been damaged over the centuries, there were still signs that it had once held magnificent items. The team worked slowly, methodically, removing the earth surrounding the chamber. As they did, they began to find objects that hinted at the grandeur of the burial. The first signs were small metal fragments, delicate pieces of jewelry, and the remnants of finely crafted items that had once adorned the body. These objects, though decayed, were exquisite in their design, suggesting that the person buried here had been incredibly wealthy, perhaps even a king. But the true treasures of the burial had not yet been uncovered. Brown knew that the most significant finds were still hidden beneath layers of soil. The team worked tirelessly, day after day, uncovering more and more of the burial chamber. The anticipation was palpable. Every piece of earth they removed brought them closer to the moment of revelation. As the excavation continued, word of the discovery spread even further. Archaeologists from across the country began to take notice, and some even traveled to Sutton Hoo to witness the dig for themselves. It was becoming clear that this was no ordinary excavation. What they had uncovered was one of the greatest archaeological finds in British history, and it was only a matter of time before the world would know the full extent of the discovery. Despite the growing attention, Basil Brown remained focused on the task at hand. The pressure was immense, but he knew that they were on the verge of something incredible. The burial chamber was nearly fully exposed, and soon they would uncover the treasures that had been hidden for centuries. As the final layers of earth were removed from the chamber, the team began to realize just how grand the burial truly was. They found evidence of finely wrought metalwork, including gold and silver items that had once adorned the person buried within. Though many of the treasures had been damaged or lost to time, what remained was enough to suggest that this was the burial of someone truly significant. The discovery of the burial chamber was a turning point in the excavation. What had begun as a simple curiosity had become a full-scale archaeological dig, one that would change the understanding of early medieval England. For Basil Brown and his team, the discovery of the ship and the chamber was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unfold in the months and years to come. The discovery of the burial chamber at Sutton Hoo marked a turning point in the excavation. The ship had been a stunning find, but the treasures hidden within the chamber were what truly revealed the significance of this ancient burial. As Basil Brown and his team carefully removed the last layers of soil, they began to uncover a collection of artifacts that hinted at the immense wealth and status of the person entombed within. The burial chamber, located at the heart of the ship, had likely once contained a wooden coffin, though all traces of the wood had long since decayed. What remained, however, was a dazzling array of items that had been placed alongside the body items that spoke of a life of power, influence, and high social standing. This was no ordinary grave. This was the final resting place of someone of immense importance, perhaps even a king. One of the first objects to emerge from the soil was a magnificent helmet. Though damaged by time and the elements, it was clear that this was no simple piece of armor. The helmet was adorned with intricate designs, including representations of fierce animals and warriors, all crafted in exquisite detail. It had once been worn by a figure of great significance, someone who likely commanded both respect and fear. The helmet, with its mask-like faceplate and iron cheek pieces, gave the impression of a powerful warrior king. Its craftsmanship suggested that the person buried here had connections to distant lands, perhaps Scandinavia, where similar helmets had been found. As the team continued to excavate, they uncovered more treasures. A finely wrought sword was found next, its hilt inlaid with gold and garnets. The sword was a symbol of power, not just a weapon, but a representation of the authority of the one who had wielded it. Alongside the sword were other items associated with warfare, including a large shield and a collection of spears. These were the tools of a leader, someone who had commanded armies and fought in battles. The items painted a picture of a man who had been both a ruler and a warrior, a figure whose life had been shaped by conflict and conquest. Yet the burial chamber also contained objects of great beauty, items that suggested the person buried here had enjoyed a life of luxury and refinement. Gold buckles, intricately crafted jewelry, and a collection of silverware were found, each piece more ornate than the last. Some of the items had been imported from far-off lands, including silver bowls and spoons from the Byzantine Empire, evidence of trade and cultural connections that spanned continents. These items showed that the person buried here had lived in a time when England was not an isolated island, but part of a wider world, a world connected by trade routes and diplomacy. Perhaps the most striking find was a large, elaborately decorated belt buckle made of solid gold. Weighing over a pound, the buckle was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring interwoven patterns that symbolized strength and unity. Its size and weight suggested that it had been worn by someone of great stature, both physically and socially. The buckle, along with the other treasures, spoke of immense wealth, the kind of wealth that only the most powerful in society could accumulate. As the team cataloged the items found in the burial chamber, it became increasingly clear that this was not just a burial, it was a statement. The person buried here had wanted to be remembered, to leave a lasting legacy. The ship, the treasures, and the sheer scale of the burial all suggested that this had been a leader of extraordinary influence, someone who had shaped the course of history in their time. But who was this person? That question lingered over the excavation like a shadow. No body had been found in the burial chamber. Centuries of decay had left little more than traces of organic matter where the body once lay. Still, archaeologists were able to piece together clues from the artifacts and the burial itself. The size of the ship and the opulence of the treasures suggested that this was the grave of an Anglo-Saxon king, perhaps even Redwald, the ruler of East Anglia in the early 7th century. Redwald was a powerful figure in Anglo-Saxon England. According to historical records, he had been a strong leader who wielded significant influence over other kings in the region. He had converted to Christianity, but also maintained traditional pagan beliefs, a fact reflected in the mix of Christian and pagan symbols found in the burial chamber. If this was indeed the grave of Redwald, it would confirm his status as one of the most important figures of the Anglo-Saxon period. The burial also revealed much about the society in which this leader had lived. The treasures found in the chamber were not just symbols of personal wealth. They were representations of the interconnectedness of early medieval Europe. The silver from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian designs all pointed to a world in which goods, ideas, and cultures flowed across borders. But while the items found in the burial chamber were awe-inspiring, they also raised questions. What had caused this king to be buried in such a grand manner? Had his death been the result of natural causes, or had he fallen in battle? Had this burial been a display of his people's devotion, or was it meant to send a message to those who came after him? The ship, laden with treasures, seemed to speak of a desire to carry these symbols of power into the afterlife, a belief that even in death, this leader would continue to hold sway over the world. As the excavation came to an end, the team knew they had uncovered something truly extraordinary. The burial chamber at Sutton Hoo had revealed treasures that had been hidden for more than 1,000 years. Treasures that told the story of a long-forgotten king and the world in which he had lived. For Basil Brown and his team, it was the culmination of months of hard work and dedication. But for the wider world, it was just the beginning of a new understanding of England's past. The treasures of Sutton Hoo would soon be displayed in museums, where people from all over the world could come and marvel at the craftsmanship and beauty of these ancient artifacts. Yet, even as they were cleaned and preserved, they would remain tied to the mystery of the person who had been buried in that ship, a figure whose identity might never be known for certain, but whose legacy would live on through the objects he left behind. The burial chamber had been unearthed, but its secrets would continue to captivate the imaginations of historians, archaeologists, and the public for generations to come. The excavation at Sutton Hoo had revealed extraordinary treasures, but it was the discovery's ripple effect that truly began to reshape the understanding of England's ancient past. As word of the find spread across Britain, the magnitude of what had been uncovered became clear, not just to archaeologists, but to the general public, scholars, and even political figures. The Sutton Hoo ship burial was quickly recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds in British history, a window into a time that had long been shrouded in mystery. In the summer of 1939, just as the treasures from Sutton Hoo were being carefully excavated, the world was on the brink of conflict. The tensions leading to the outbreak of World War II were mounting, and in many ways, the discovery at Sutton Hoo served as a reminder of Britain's deep history and resilience. As the nation prepared for the uncertainties of war, the treasures from this ancient burial offered a sense of pride and continuity, connecting modern Britons to their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. For Edith Pretty, the landowner whose curiosity had sparked the excavation, the discovery had an emotional impact. She had long suspected that the mounds on her estate hid something special, but even she couldn't have imagined the grandeur of what lay beneath. Edith, a reserved and thoughtful woman, had always been interested in history and archaeology, but the scale of the find at Sutton Hoo exceeded her wildest expectations. She visited the excavation site daily, quietly observing as Basil Brown and his team painstakingly unearthed each artifact. Though Edith had initiated the dig, she remained humble about her role, insisting that the discovery belonged to history. In the months following the excavation, Edith made a decision that would forever cement her place in the story of Sutton Hoo. Rather than keeping the treasures for herself or selling them, she donated the entire collection to the British Museum. It was an act of generosity that reflected her deep sense of responsibility to history and her desire for the treasures to be studied and preserved for future generations. The decision ensured that the artifacts would be accessible to the public and to scholars, who would spend decades analyzing the find and its implications. The British Museum, which had long been a repository for the world's greatest cultural artifacts, was quick to recognize the importance of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The items, including the famous helmet, the gold belt buckle, and the intricately crafted jewelry, were displayed prominently, attracting visitors from across the country and beyond. People flocked to see the artifacts, eager to catch a glimpse of the ancient past and to learn more about the mysterious figure who had been buried in such splendor. The public reaction to the Sutton Hoo discovery was overwhelming. Newspapers ran headlines about the buried treasure and the king in the ship, fueling speculation about the identity of the person entombed in the ship burial. Theories abounded, with some suggesting that the ship had belonged to a legendary warrior, while others believed it was the resting place of a great king. The fascination with the find extended beyond the borders of Britain, with international scholars and archaeologists expressing interest in studying the artifacts and the burial site. But while the treasures themselves were stunning, It was the broader implications of the discovery that truly excited the academic community. Before Sutton Hoo, the early medieval period in England, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was seen as a time of cultural stagnation, a period following the fall of the Roman Empire, when much of Europe was thought to have fallen into disarray. The Sutton Hoo find challenged this view, offering evidence of a sophisticated and cosmopolitan society that had existed in England in the 6th and 7th centuries. The discovery of objects from distant lands, including silverware from Byzantium and garnets from as far away as India, demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxon elite were part of a vast network of trade and cultural exchange. These connections extended across Europe and beyond, suggesting that early medieval England was far more interconnected with the wider world than previously thought. The items found in the burial chamber revealed a society that valued craftsmanship, artistry, and wealth, a far cry from the image of a dark and isolated age. For historians and archaeologists, the Sutton Hoo ship burial opened up new lines of inquiry. Who was the person buried in the ship, and what did his burial tell us about the society he lived in? The consensus began to form around the idea that the burial belonged to Redwold, the king of East Anglia, a powerful figure who had been instrumental in the politics of early medieval England. While no definitive proof existed to confirm Redwold's identity as the person buried in the ship, the evidence, both historical and archaeological, pointed strongly in that direction. As the academic community delved deeper into the meaning of the Sutton Hoo treasures, the site itself became a point of national pride. The discovery was seen as a testament to Britain's deep and rich history, a reminder that the country's roots extended far back into the early medieval period. This sense of pride was particularly potent in the context of the looming war. As Britain prepared for the possibility of conflict, the Sutton Hoo find served as a symbol of resilience and continuity, a reminder that the nation had weathered countless challenges throughout its long history. However, the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 brought new challenges to the preservation of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The artifacts, now housed in the British Museum, were packed away and moved to secure storage to protect them from potential bombing raids. It would be several years before they could be displayed again, but even in storage, the significance of the find continued to grow. In the years following the war, the treasures of Sutton Hoo were once again placed on display, drawing renewed interest from scholars and the public alike. The site itself became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in England's early medieval past. Archaeological work at Sutton Hoo continued, with new discoveries shedding further light on the burial and the culture that had created it. As time passed, the Sutton Hoo ship burial became more than just an archaeological discovery. It became a symbol of Britain's cultural heritage. The treasures found in the burial chamber were celebrated not just for their beauty, but for what they represented, a connection to the distant past, to a time when kings ruled the land and the seas, and when the Anglo-Saxon people laid the foundations for the England that would emerge in the centuries to come. The impact of Sutton Hoo extended beyond the academic world. It influenced popular culture, inspiring books, films, and even artwork. The treasures, with their intricate designs and mysterious origins, captured the imagination of people around the world. The Sutton Hoo helmet, in particular, became an iconic symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, its distinctive design appearing in countless representations of early medieval warriors. But more than anything, Sutton Hoo stood as a testament to the power of curiosity and perseverance. What had begun as a simple desire to explore a set of burial mounds on a quiet Suffolk estate had led to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. The impact of that discovery would be felt for generations, reminding the world of the enduring legacy of the Anglo-Saxon people and the mysteries that still lay buried beneath the earth. The Sutton Hoo discovery forever altered the understanding of early medieval England. Long after the final artifact had been unearthed and the excavation had concluded, The mysteries of the ship burial continue to captivate historians, archaeologists, and the general public. The artifacts, now safely housed in the British Museum, were more than just relics. They were keys to unlocking a forgotten past, one that had been shrouded in mystery for centuries. As scholars continued to study the treasures, new insights into the life and times of the Anglo-Saxons emerged. The burial itself became a symbol of the sophisticated society that had existed in England during the early 7th century, a society far more complex and interconnected than previously believed. Sutton Hoo had given the world a glimpse into the life of a ruler who had commanded immense respect and wielded significant power, whether it was Redwold, as many believed, or another figure of equal prominence. Despite all that had been uncovered, questions still lingered. Chief among them was the identity of the person buried in the ship. While the evidence pointed strongly to Redwold, the lack of definitive proof left room for debate. Some scholars suggested alternative possibilities, including other kings or powerful nobles from the East Anglian kingdom. The absence of human remains, likely lost to the ravages of time and the acidic soil, meant that the mystery of the burial's occupant might never be fully resolved. Even without a clear identity, the significance of the burial was undeniable. The ship, the treasures, and the careful arrangement of the grave goods all pointed to someone of immense importance. This was a person whose life had been marked by power, prestige, and wealth, someone who had commanded loyalty and respect from those around them. The grandeur of the burial reflected the importance placed on status and honor in Anglo-Saxon society, where kings and nobles were celebrated both in life and in death. The mystery extended beyond the identity of the buried figure. The purpose of the ship burial itself raised questions. Why had such an elaborate ceremony been conducted, and what did it symbolize? Ship burials were rare in England, and the practice was more commonly associated with Scandinavian cultures. Some historians believe that the Sutton Hoo burial was a reflection of the complex cultural influences at play in early medieval England. The Anglo-Saxons, who had come to Britain as invaders, had absorbed elements of both Roman and Scandinavian traditions, creating a unique blend of customs and beliefs. The ship burial, with its mixture of Christian and pagan symbols, suggested that the person buried at Sutton Hoo had navigated a world in which old and new beliefs coexisted. Redwold, if he was indeed the person buried there, had been known for his dual faith embracing Christianity while still honoring traditional pagan practices. The burial reflected this tension, with the treasures revealing a world in which religious beliefs were evolving, but not yet settled. The items found in the burial chamber also offered clues about the broader world in which this person had lived. The silverware from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian and Frankish designs all pointed to a world connected by trade and diplomacy. The Sutton Hoo burial was not just a testament to one person's power. It was a reflection of a global network of exchange where goods and ideas flowed across borders. As the years passed, Sutton Hoo became a touchstone for those studying the early medieval period. Archaeologists continued to explore the site, conducting further excavations and uncovering additional evidence of the Anglo-Saxon people who had once inhabited the area. While no discoveries rivaled the grandeur of the original ship burial, each new find added to the growing picture of life in East Anglia during the early 7th century. The site itself was transformed into a place of historical importance. Sutton Hoo, once a quiet estate with little public attention, became a destination for visitors from around the world. People came to walk among the burial mounds, to imagine the grand ship that had once rested beneath the earth, and to learn about the Anglo-Saxon kings who had shaped England's early history. The National Trust, which took over the management of the site, worked to preserve the landscape and educate the public about the significance of the discovery. The Sutton Hoo ship burial also left a lasting mark on popular culture. The story of the excavation and the treasures it uncovered inspired books, documentaries, and films, all seeking to capture the drama and mystery of the find. The iconic image of the Sutton Hoo helmet, with its menacing faceplate and intricate designs, became a symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, appearing in countless depictions of early medieval warriors. The discovery continued to spark the imaginations of writers, artists, and filmmakers who were drawn to the idea of a long-lost king buried with his treasures, waiting to be rediscovered. Yet for all the attention Sutton Hoo received, the site remained, at its core, a place of deep historical and emotional significance. The ship burial was a reminder of the fragility of history, of how easily the past can be forgotten, buried beneath layers of earth, and how it can be uncovered only through persistence and curiosity. Basil Brown, the self-taught archaeologist who had first unearthed the ship, had never imagined the scope of what he would find. His dedication and careful work had revealed a treasure trove of history that might otherwise have remained hidden. In the decades following the excavation, Brown's role in the discovery was finally recognized. Though initially overshadowed by professional archaeologists who had later joined the dig, Brown's contributions were celebrated as those of a skilled and dedicated archaeologist. His careful methods and deep respect for the site had ensured that the treasures of Sutton Hoo were preserved for future generations. Today, he is remembered as the man who brought one of England's greatest archaeological discoveries to light. As the 21st century began, Sutton Hoo continued to capture the public's imagination. New technologies allowed archaeologists to explore the site in ways that had once been impossible, using ground-penetrating radar and other tools to search for hidden features beneath the earth. These advancements, while yielding fascinating insights, also underscored how much of the past still lay waiting to be discovered. The ship burial at Sutton Hoo was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that archaeologists and historians were still piecing together. For all the answers Sutton Hoo had provided, the site remained a place of wonder and speculation. Who had been buried there, and what had their life been like? What had driven their people to create such a magnificent burial? And what did it say about their beliefs, their values, and their place in the world? These questions, and many others, would likely remain unanswered, but that was part of the magic of Sutton Hoo. It was a place where history and mystery intertwined, where the past reached out to the present in ways both profound and elusive. The ship and its treasures had been buried for more than 1,000 years, hidden from the world, waiting for the right moment to be found. And now, as the story of Sutton Hoo continued to unfold, it was clear that the discovery had not only changed the way people understood the past, it had become part of the fabric of Britain's national identity. A reminder of the deep roots that connected the present to the distant, mysterious past. New Orleans, with its vibrant culture and rich history, has long been a city filled with intrigue. The French Quarter, in particular, stands as a testament to centuries of human experience, both glorious and grim. Amidst the colorful streets and lively jazz clubs, there exists a house unlike any other, the infamous Villari Mansion. Its elegant facade hides a story steeped in tragedy, suffering, and a legacy that has haunted the city for nearly 2 centuries. Madame Delphine Lowry, born Marie Delphine McCarty in 1787, grew up in a world of privilege. She was part of New Orleans high society, and from an early age, she understood the importance of appearances. Her beauty, charm, and social standing made her one of the most admired women in the city. She was married 3 times, each union increasing her wealth and status. But it was her 3rd marriage, to Dr. Leonard Louis Lalaurie, that would cement her place in the city's dark history. The couple resided at 1140 Royal Street, a grand mansion in the heart of the French Quarter. The house, with its tall windows, iron lace balconies, and stately appearance, was the perfect setting for Delphine's lavish social gatherings. To the outside world, she was the epitome of refinement, hosting elegant parties that attracted the city's elite. Guests marveled at her grace, her wealth, and the beauty of her home. Yet, behind this polished exterior, something far more sinister was happening within the walls of the mansion. From the early days of her residency, rumors swirled about Madame Lalaury's treatment of those enslaved in her household. While many wealthy families in New Orleans kept enslaved workers, there was something unsettling about the way Delphine interacted with them. Neighbors noticed strange, disturbing incidents, people whispering about how her staff seemed to disappear, never to be seen again. It was said that Madame Lalaury had an uncharacteristically cold and distant demeanor towards them, a stark contrast to the warmth she showed her high society peers. One story that circulated involved a young girl who had worked in the house. She had been seen brushing Delphine's hair on the balcony one afternoon. Allegedly, the girl made a mistake, tugging too hard at a tangle. Madame Lalaury, enraged, chased her through the house and onto the rooftop. The young girl, in her fear, leapt to escape Delphine's wrath, falling to her tragic end. It was an incident that should have triggered public outrage, but instead, it was quietly covered up, thanks to Lalaury's wealth and influence. Over time, other accounts began to emerge. Some spoke of faint cries coming from the mansion late at night, while others claimed they saw strange figures peering from the windows as if pleading for help. Still, Madame Lalaury's social standing remained intact. Wealth, power, and status allowed her to hide the unspeakable acts that were happening within her home. Dr. Lalaury, a man of medicine, seemed indifferent to his wife's behavior. Though he was present in the mansion, he often absented himself from the household affairs, spending more time in his practice or indulging in the social privileges of the era. While his presence could have been a moderating influence on his wife, there were rumors that he too turned a blind eye to the growing darkness within their home. Madame Lalaury was careful, ensuring that her public image remained flawless. She continued to host elaborate parties, where the most influential people in New Orleans would gather in her grand ballroom, sipping fine wine, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the sinister reality hidden behind the mansion's closed doors. Yet the cracks in this perfect facade were growing harder to ignore. People began whispering more openly about her cruelty, but it wasn't until a tragic event in 1834 that the full extent of the horror within the mansion would be revealed. An accident in the kitchen, a fire that quickly spread, would bring everything to light. As the fire raged through the lower levels of the mansion, passers-by rushed to help. It was during this chaos that the full truth of Delphine Lalaury's life came to the surface. The firefighters who responded to the blaze discovered something unimaginable, an attic full of unspeakable suffering. This discovery would forever change the legacy of the Lalaury mansion. Madame Lalaury, once admired for her beauty and charm, was now reviled. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of wealth and elegance, would forever be stained by the horrors that had occurred within its walls. The building itself seemed to absorb the cruelty, its once pristine appearance now a reminder of the darkness that lingered there. After the fire, the truth spread rapidly through the city. The socialite, once revered, was now despised. Crowds gathered in outrage outside her mansion, demanding justice for the atrocities discovered within. But before they could take any action, Delphine Lalaury vanished, slipping away into the night, never to face justice for her actions. She fled New Orleans, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty that would forever haunt the city. The Lalaury mansion, scarred by its history, was left to stand as a reminder of the dark deeds that had taken place within. Over the years, it would be sold and resold, with each new owner finding themselves unable to live comfortably within its walls. The mansion had become something more than just a house. It had become a symbol of the city's most tragic chapter, a place where the echoes of the past continued to linger. The events of April 10, 1834, marked a turning point for the city of New Orleans. A fire broke out in the kitchen of the Grand Lalaurie mansion, sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. Neighbors rushed to help, fearing for the safety of Madame Delphine Lalaurie and her family. As they approached the house, what began as a simple act of concern quickly spiraled into a moment that would shock the city to its core. The fire, though dangerous, was not the main story. It was what the fire revealed that would leave an indelible scar on the history of New Orleans. As firefighters battled the flames, they discovered a locked room on the top floor, an attic that was previously hidden from view. Desperate cries from inside the house led them to force open the door. What they found would horrify even the most hardened among them. The attic was not merely a storage space, but a chamber of unimaginable suffering. Within its dark and claustrophobic walls, a group of enslaved people had been confined, their bodies weakened and scarred from prolonged mistreatment. The air inside the room was thick with the stench of neglect, and the conditions were far worse than anyone could have imagined. Many of them were in a state of malnourishment, with signs of severe physical harm. The most harrowing discovery, however, was the apparatuses and tools that had been used to inflict pain. The evidence of intentional harm was undeniable makeshift restraints, chains, and devices that had no place in a household. It became clear that this was not a result of simple mistreatment, but something far more deliberate and cruel. Witnesses described the scene in hushed tones for years to come. The trauma they encountered was so intense that many struggled to find words to fully capture what they had seen. Those who had previously dismissed rumors about Madame Lalaurie's behavior could no longer turn a blind eye. The truth had been laid bare, and it was more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Madame Lalaurie, once a celebrated socialite, had harbored a darker side that had remained hidden for far too long. As the fire raged below, she attempted to maintain her composure, denying any knowledge of the atrocities uncovered in her home. But the evidence was overwhelming, and word spread quickly through the city. The genteel mask that she had worn for years was shattered in an instant. As the news of the discovery reached the streets, a wave of outrage swept through New Orleans. People who had once attended Lalaurie's lavish parties were now among the crowds demanding justice. The story of her cruelty spread like wildfire, and soon a mob gathered outside the mansion, their anger palpable. They called for her to be held accountable, but Madame Lalaurie, ever calculating, managed to flee the scene before she could face the wrath of the public. In the days following the fire, the Lalaurie mansion became a symbol of horror, a place where unspeakable suffering had taken place. It was said that the cries of those who had been harmed could still be heard within its walls, echoing through the now abandoned house. The building itself seemed to take on a life of its own, as if it had absorbed the pain and anguish that had occurred within. The authorities launched an investigation, but the damage had already been done. The full extent of Madame Lalaurie's actions could never be fully documented, as many of the enslaved people who had suffered under her care did not survive to tell their stories. For those who had been found alive, their recovery would be a long and painful process. The city grappled with the aftermath, struggling to come to terms with the fact that such cruelty had been happening right under their noses. Dr. Leonard Louis Lalaurie, her husband, had been absent during the fire, and there were conflicting reports about his involvement in the horrors that took place in the attic. Some claimed that he was complicit, turning a blind eye to his wife's actions, while others believed he was unaware of the full extent of her cruelty. Regardless of his role, the Lalaurie name was now synonymous with suffering, and both husband and wife vanished into obscurity, leaving behind only speculation about their fates. The city, meanwhile, had to contend with the aftermath. The mansion, now abandoned, stood as a reminder of the horrors that had taken place. Neighbors avoided the building, unwilling to go near the place that had become a symbol of such intense suffering. It was said that strange noises could be heard at night, faint whispers, the sound of footsteps and cries that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Those who were brave enough to approach the mansion reported an overwhelming feeling of unease, as if the building itself was alive with the memories of what had occurred there. Over time, the Lalaurie mansion became more than just a physical structure. It became a dark legend, a story passed down through generations about the dangers of unchecked cruelty. The people of New Orleans, who had once celebrated the Lalaurie family, now spoke of them only in whispers, as if even mentioning their name might invite some dark force into their lives. For years after the fire, the mansion stood empty, its windows dark and its walls decaying. No one dared to live there, and it became a place of ghost stories and urban legends. People claimed to see figures in the windows, shadows that would disappear when approached, and lights that flickered at night, despite the house being uninhabited. As the years passed, the house became a site of fascination for those interested in the supernatural. Paranormal investigators, curious tourists, and even thrill-seekers flocked to the mansion, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghosts that were said to haunt its halls. The house had taken on a life of its own, its dark history forever tied to the legend of Madame Lalaurie. But beneath the ghost stories and the sensational headlines, the true horror of the Lalaurie mansion remained rooted in the very real suffering of those who had been harmed there. Their voices, silenced for so long, were finally being heard, though only through the dark legacy of the building where they had lived and died. The Lalaurie mansion was no longer just a house. It was a testament to the horrors that humans could inflict upon one another. And though Madame Lalaurie had escaped justice in her lifetime, the echoes of her cruelty would continue to reverberate through the city of New Orleans for generations to come. When the Lalaurie mansion fell silent after the events of 1834, the once vibrant home now stood as a monument to human suffering. The horrors unearthed in the attic haunted the streets of New Orleans, and the city's residents grappled with the magnitude of what had occurred behind the mansion's elegant facade. Madame Delphine Lalaurie had vanished into the night, her name forever tarnished, but the scar she left behind remained deep and festering. In the weeks and months that followed the fire, rumors circulated about Madame Lalaurie's fate. Some believed she had fled to France, returning to the homeland of her ancestors to live out the rest of her days in exile. Others speculated that she had assumed a new identity and was hiding somewhere in the American South, far from the public eye. There were even whispers that she had met an untimely end, punished by some divine force for her unspeakable actions. But none of these rumors were ever confirmed. The truth about Delphine Lalaurie's final years remains one of the many mysteries surrounding her legacy. What was certain, however, was the immediate aftermath of the mansion itself. Once the flames were extinguished and the full extent of the suffering within its walls was revealed, the Lalaurie mansion became a place of infamy. The house, with its graceful architecture and prime location on Royal Street, should have been a coveted property, but its dark history cast a long shadow. No one wanted to live there. It was said that the very walls were tainted, that they had absorbed the cries of those who had suffered and could never be cleansed. The mansion stood empty for many years, its windows boarded up and its grand facade slowly deteriorating. Neighbors avoided walking past it, and the building became a source of superstitions. People claimed to hear strange noises coming from within the walls, muffled voices, eerie footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of sobbing. Even in the daylight, the mansion exuded an atmosphere of dread. It was as if the house itself was mourning the lives that had been lost within its walls. Over time, stories of a curse began to take hold. The house, some said, had been cursed by the souls of those who had suffered there. They believed that the spirits of the enslaved people who had endured unimaginable pain at the hands of Madame Lalaurie were still trapped within the mansion, unable to find peace. Visitors and passers-by reported seeing shadowy figures in the windows, even though the house was uninhabited. Others claimed to hear faint whispers, as if the spirits were crying out for justice that had never been delivered. As the legend of the curse grew, so did the mansion's reputation as a place of paranormal activity. In a city as steeped in supernatural lore as New Orleans, the Lalaurie Mansion quickly became one of its most notorious haunted locations. It was said that those who dared to enter the house would feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow, a weight pressing down on them as they walked through its dark, empty halls. Some claimed to have seen the ghost of Madame Lalaurie herself, still wandering the mansion, forever bound to the place where she had caused so much suffering. Despite the fear that surrounded the mansion, it did not remain abandoned forever. The property changed hands several times over the years, with each new owner hoping to restore the building to its former glory. But no one stayed for long. Each time the house was sold, the new residents would quickly abandon it, citing strange occurrences and an oppressive, unsettling energy that made living there unbearable. Furniture would move on its own, doors would slam shut without warning, and cold spots would appear in rooms that had been warmed by the sun just moments before. The mansion seemed determined to drive away anyone who tried to make it their home. One of the most famous incidents occurred in the late 19th century, when the mansion was purchased by a wealthy businessman. Hoping to profit from the building's prime location, he turned the mansion into an apartment complex. But almost immediately, tenants began to report strange and disturbing experiences. Objects would disappear, only to reappear in bizarre places. Loud bangs and disembodied voices would wake them in the middle of the night. One tenant even claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of a woman dressed in an old-fashioned gown, standing at the foot of his bed. Needless to say, the apartment complex was not a success, and the building was once again abandoned. As the years passed, the mansion's reputation continued to grow. Stories of the hauntings attracted the attention of paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and curious tourists alike. Some came hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural, while others were drawn by the dark history of Madame Lalaurie and the infamous attic where so much suffering had taken place. The mansion had become a macabre tourist attraction, a place where history and legend intertwined to create something both horrifying and fascinating. But beneath the sensational stories of hauntings and curses lay the true tragedy of the Lalaurie Mansion, the suffering of those who had been harmed within its walls. Their voices, silenced by history, had been forgotten by many, overshadowed by the legend of the house itself. Yet the presence of their spirits, whether real or imagined, served as a reminder that the true horror of the Lalaurie Mansion was not in the ghost stories, but in the very real human cruelty that had taken place there. In the decades after Madame Lalaurie's departure, the mansion became a symbol of the darker aspects of human nature. It was a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, there can be darkness hidden beneath the surface. The curse of the Lalaurie Mansion, it seemed, was not just a supernatural affliction, but a reflection of the deep scars left by the cruelty that had been inflicted there. As the years turned into decades and then centuries, the Lalaurie Mansion remained a focal point of intrigue and fear. Each new owner, whether skeptical or superstitious, could not escape the house's dark history. The building itself seemed to resist any attempt to erase its past, as if the very stones had absorbed the horror of what had taken place. And so, the legend of the Lalaurie Mansion continued to grow, its place in the annals of New Orleans' haunted history cemented forever. Though the mansion still stands today, restored and preserved, it remains shrouded in mystery. Many believe that the spirits of those who suffered there are still trapped within its walls, unable to move on. The building's grand appearance belies the darkness that lingers inside, a reminder that some wounds can never truly heal, and some stories are too tragic to forget. As the years passed and the events of 1834 faded from living memory, the Lalaurie Mansion slowly transitioned from a house of horrors to a site of fascination for those drawn to the mysterious and unexplained. New Orleans, a city already known for its deep connection to the supernatural, found in the Lalaurie Mansion one of its most infamous landmarks. The mansion's dark history, entwined with tales of tragedy and cruelty, made it a magnet for ghost hunters, paranormal enthusiasts, and curious visitors from around the world. By the early 20th century, the mansion had changed hands numerous times, with each owner attempting, and inevitably failing, to restore the building to its former grandeur. The house, beautiful though it was, carried an unmistakable aura, an energy that made even the bravest of souls uneasy. Many owners found themselves facing more than just the challenge of restoring a historic property. They faced the mansion's reputation, and for some, the belief that the house was haunted proved to be too much. For decades, people reported strange happenings in and around the mansion. From unexplained noises to mysterious apparitions, the stories that emerged from the Lalaurie Mansion seemed to confirm what many had long suspected, that the house had never truly been free of its tragic past. Reports of ghostly figures roaming the halls were common, and visitors often claimed to feel a deep, oppressive presence when they entered the house. One of the most frequently reported phenomena was the sighting of a woman believed to be Madame Delphine Lalaurie herself. Dressed in a period gown, her figure was said to appear suddenly in various parts of the mansion, sometimes near the grand staircase, other times in the ballroom where she once entertained New Orleans' elite. Her presence, many believed, was not a comforting one. Those who claimed to have seen her often described an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were in the presence of someone capable of unspeakable acts. Some visitors even reported feeling an inexplicable coldness whenever they approached the area where her ghost was said to appear. But it wasn't just Madame Lalaurie who was believed to haunt the mansion. Many believed that the spirits of the enslaved people who had suffered under her cruel hand were also still trapped within the walls of the house. The attic, where the most horrifying discoveries had been made, was the site of numerous paranormal experiences. Visitors reported hearing faint cries and whispers, as if the spirits of those who had endured so much pain were still calling out for help. Some even claimed to feel invisible hands brushing against them or pulling at their clothing, as though the spirits were trying to make contact with the living. Despite the growing number of paranormal reports, the Lalaurie Mansion continued to attract attention. Its status as one of the most haunted locations in New Orleans only increased its allure. Television shows, books, and documentaries exploring the mansion's dark past and ghostly activity brought even more attention to the already infamous house. Paranormal investigators flocked to the site, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Some claimed to have recorded strange voices on their equipment, disembodied voices that seemed to cry out in pain or confusion. Others took photographs that showed unexplained shadows or eerie orbs of light hovering in the air. Over time, the Lalaurie Mansion became not just a place where history had been made, but a key location in the folklore of the city. Locals and tourists alike whispered about the house, trading stories of their own eerie encounters or tales they had heard from friends and family. The mansion had become more than just a physical building. It was a living legend, a place where the boundary between the past and the present, between the living and the dead, seemed to blur. For many, the mansion represented the darker side of New Orleans history. While the city was known for its vibrant culture, music, and festivals, the Lalaurie Mansion was a reminder that even the most beautiful places could hold dark secrets. The house, with its elegant architecture and prime location in the French Quarter, was a symbol of the extremes of wealth and power that had once defined New Orleans society. Yet beneath its beauty lay a history of cruelty, one that could never be fully erased. As paranormal activity around the mansion grew more notorious, so did the house's reputation as a dangerous place. Visitors who entered the mansion often described feelings of nausea, dizziness, or overwhelming sadness. Some even claimed that the mansion had a malevolent energy that the spirits within were not simply restless, but angry, perhaps vengeful. Over the years, more extreme accounts emerged. People reported being physically harmed while inside the house, scratches appearing on their arms or legs, or even being shoved by unseen forces. These incidents only added to the legend of the mansion, making it seem like a place where the past continued to assert its power over the present. By the mid-20th century, the Lalaurie Mansion had become a fixture in New Orleans ghost tours. Guides would lead groups past the house, recounting its grisly history and the terrifying encounters that had taken place within. For many tourists, the Lalaurie Mansion was the highlight of their trip, an opportunity to get as close as possible to one of the most haunted locations in America. The house became an essential stop for anyone interested in the supernatural, and its dark reputation only grew with time. Yet for all the stories of hauntings and ghosts, there was also a deeper legacy at play. The Lalaurie Mansion, with its history of suffering, forced the city to confront a part of its past that was often overlooked. The cruelty inflicted upon the enslaved people who lived and worked in the mansion was not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger, darker history that had shaped New Orleans and the American South. The house, haunted though it may be, stood as a reminder of the human cost of greed, cruelty, and unchecked power. In recent years, the mansion has once again been restored, with new owners taking great care to preserve its historical significance. Yet despite the renovations, the aura of the house remains unchanged. Visitors continue to report strange occurrences, and the mansion's reputation as a haunted house remains as strong as ever. For many, the Lalaurie Mansion will always be more than just a historic building. It will remain a place where the past refuses to stay buried, where the spirits of those who suffered continue to make their presence known. Whether the Lalaurie Mansion is truly haunted or whether its reputation is the result of centuries of storytelling and fear, one thing is certain: the legacy of the house is deeply intertwined with the history of New Orleans. It is a place where the weight of the past is felt in every corner, where the walls seem to whisper of forgotten tragedies, and where the line between the living and the dead is as thin as the fog that often rolls in from the Mississippi River. In the 21st century, the Lalaurie Mansion stands as a paradox, a symbol of both history and legend, fact and myth, beauty and horror. The world may have moved on from the events of 1834, but the mansion itself remains a physical embodiment of those dark days, forever linked to its infamous past. Despite the modern renovations and the shifting landscape of New Orleans, the mansion continues to capture the public's imagination like few other places in America. Today, the Lalaurie Mansion is not just a historical landmark. It has become a cornerstone of popular culture, a setting for numerous films, television shows, and books, all exploring the darker corners of the human psyche. Whether portrayed in dramas, thrillers, or supernatural tales, the mansion's story is retold time and time again, each version adding a new layer to its already complex mythology. One of the most notable examples of this is its inclusion in American horror stories, where the mansion's history is fictionalized and reimagined for modern audiences, though always with an air of eerie realism that echoes the true horrors of its past. The fascination with the Lalaurie Mansion extends far beyond the borders of New Orleans. Ghost tours and paranormal investigations have been featured in documentaries and online content, drawing viewers who are captivated by the idea of a real-life haunted house. Every year, thousands of tourists flock to the city, eager to catch a glimpse of the place where history and the supernatural intertwine. Standing in front of the mansion's elegant facade, it's easy to forget that behind those walls, untold pain once occurred. And that's exactly what makes it so enticing for those intrigued by the macabre. For some, the Lalaurie Mansion is more than just a tourist attraction. It's a portal into the mysteries of the afterlife. Paranormal investigators have spent years documenting their findings, hoping to provide proof of what so many have claimed to experience firsthand. Some investigators enter the mansion armed with cutting-edge technology, thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and voice recorders designed to capture sounds inaudible to the human ear. What they find often defies explanation. Shadows dart across empty rooms. Temperatures drop inexplicably, and strange, disembodied voices are captured on audio. Some investigators have even reported feeling physically touched by unseen hands, reinforcing the belief that the mansion is more than just haunted. It's alive with an otherworldly energy. Despite the numerous investigations, there has never been definitive proof that the mansion is haunted. Skeptics argue that the stories surrounding the house are nothing more than folklore, exaggerated by decades of retellings and the city's love for ghost stories. But for every skeptic, there is someone who has experienced something unexplainable, something that suggests that the mansion's dark. History has left an indelible mark on the present. One of the most perplexing mysteries surrounding the Lalaurie mansion is the fate of Madame Delphine Lalaurie herself. While the general consensus is that she fled New Orleans after the fire, her exact whereabouts after her escape remains shrouded in mystery. Some believe she fled to France, living out her final years in anonymity, while others claim she never left Louisiana at all. There are even rumors that she returned to New Orleans in secret, blending into the city's society under a false identity. Although many have searched for definitive answers, none have been found, leaving her ultimate fate one of the mansion's most enduring mysteries. As for the mansion itself, its future seems just as uncertain as its past. Despite its renovations and modern use, there remains an undeniable sense that the house is still tied to the past, as though it cannot escape the horrors that once occurred within its walls. Those who live near the mansion often report strange happenings, lights flickering in the windows, unexplained sounds late at night, and an unsettling feeling that they are being watched. Even after all these years, the mansion continues to captivate and terrify in equal measure. The people of New Orleans, long accustomed to the city's rich tapestry of supernatural tales, often treat the Lalaurie mansion with a mixture of reverence and fear. For some, it's simply part of the city's history, a tragic chapter that reflects the darker aspects of humanity. For others, it's a warning, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and cruelty. And for many, it's a place to avoid altogether, a site too steeped in sorrow and suffering to be approached lightly. Yet for all the terror associated with the mansion, it has also become a place of reflection. In recent years, more attention has been paid to the true victims of the Lalaurie mansion, the enslaved men, women, and children who suffered at the hands of Madame Lalaurie. Their stories, long overshadowed by the legend of the mansion itself, are slowly being brought to the forefront. Exhibits and historical tours now make a concerted effort to honor the lives that were lost and to tell the fuller, more nuanced story of the mansion's past. In many ways, the Lalaurie mansion has come to represent the complexity of New Orleans itself, a city where beauty and tragedy often go hand in hand, and where the weight of history is felt in every corner. The mansion, with its grand architecture and dark legacy, stands as a testament to the city's resilience, but also as a reminder of the cruelty and suffering that once lurked behind its closed doors. It is both a symbol of the horrors of the past and a cautionary tale about the dangers of forgetting history. Even as the mansion continues to evolve, whether as a private residence, a tourist destination, or a historical landmark, it remains a place of unanswered questions. Is it truly haunted? Will the spirits that are said to inhabit its halls ever find peace? And will the true story of Madame Lalaurie's life and crimes ever be fully uncovered? The Lalaurie mansion, with its dark past and uncertain future, stands at the intersection of history and myth, a place where the lines between the living and the dead are forever blurred. And as long as it remains standing, it will continue to fascinate, terrify, and captivate those who dare to look beyond its elegant exterior and confront the chilling truths that lie within. The mansion's tale, though centuries old, is far from over. As new generations discover the story of Madame Lowry and her house of horrors, the legend will continue to grow, ensuring that the Lowry Mansion remains one of the most haunting and mysterious locations in all of New Orleans, a place where the past never truly dies, and where the echoes of its dark history continue to reverberate through time. Anne Boleyn was born into ambition. From the moment she set foot in the glittering courts of Europe, it was clear that her future was destined to be anything but ordinary. Anne wasn't just beautiful, she was captivating. Her sharp wit, confidence, and elegance made her stand out among women in an era that demanded obedience and silence. It wasn't long before her name reached the most powerful ears in England, those of King Henry VIII. Henry, once a devout Catholic married to Queen Catherine of Aragon for nearly 2 decades, found himself increasingly restless. Catherine had given him no male heir, only a daughter, Princess Mary. By the time Henry first saw Anne, his frustration with his marriage had grown into quiet desperation. Anne's refusal to become his mistress was like a spark on dry wood. It ignited a fire in the king that neither could contain. Anne was no ordinary woman. She understood the risks, but also saw the opportunity. She resisted Henry's advances, not out of modesty, but because she knew her power lay in withholding what he desired most. Instead, Anne offered him a tantalizing promise, not a fleeting romance, but something far greater, the chance to reshape history. If Henry made her his queen, she could give him what Catherine never could, a son and a legacy. The king was enthralled. What began as flirtation soon turned into obsession. Henry sought an annulment from Catherine, setting off a series of political and religious upheavals that would ripple through England for generations. To marry Anne, Henry broke from the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England and declaring himself its supreme head. His actions shocked Europe, but nothing could stand between him and his new love. By 1533, Henry and Anne were married. She was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony, her dark hair crowned with jewels. The future looked bright for both of them. But from that moment, Anne's ascent was accompanied by the first hints of her fall. Anne was radiant, but the expectations placed on her shoulders were crushing. The court's whispers never ceased. Many saw her as a schemer who had lured the king away from his loyal queen. Others believed she had bewitched Henry, using sorcery to manipulate him. Even those who admired her ambition kept their distance, knowing that the king's favor was as fleeting as a gust of wind. Anne's charm began to wane when she failed to deliver the one thing Henry needed most, a healthy son. In September 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, a child destined for greatness, but not the heir Henry had hoped for. Though Henry initially hid his disappointment, the pressure on Anne intensified. Anne's second pregnancy ended in tragedy, an event that shook her to the core. She blamed herself, convinced that the stress of the court and the king's growing coldness had affected her health. Each failed pregnancy became a silent wound, deepening her anxiety. Her relationship with Henry, once so passionate, began to unravel. The king, ever impatient, turned his gaze elsewhere. Anne could sense it. Every new glance he gave another woman felt like a dagger to her heart. Desperation began to cloud her judgment. She became more volatile, lashing out at courtiers and even at Henry himself. The woman who had once held the king's heart in her hands was now clinging to it by a thread. At court, Anne's enemies multiplied. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, the king's trusted advisor. Once an ally, Cromwell now saw Anne as a threat to his political ambitions. He knew the tides were turning against her, and he was determined to be on the winning side. Quietly, he began gathering evidence against the queen, building a case that would seal her fate. Anne also faced opposition from the supporters of Catherine and her daughter, Mary. Many in England believed Anne's rise had been an affront to God, and they saw her difficulties in bearing a son as divine punishment. These factions waited in the shadows, biding their time until Anne's inevitable downfall. Meanwhile, Anne's insecurities grew. She began to push harder for the removal of her rivals, particularly Jane Seymour, a quiet but cunning young woman who had caught Henry's eye. Anne knew that Jane was more than just a passing distraction. She was a threat to everything Anne had fought to achieve. In her desperation, Anne confronted Henry, demanding that he banish Jane from court. But Henry's patience with Anne had worn thin. He was no longer the besotted lover who had broken with Rome for her. Now, he was a king burdened by an unruly wife. Anne's world began to crumble in the spring of 1536. A series of unfortunate events unfolded with shocking speed. The first blow came with the death of Catherine of Aragon in January. Rather than feeling relief at her rival's passing, Anne sensed a shift in the air. Catherine's death freed Henry from the shadow of his first marriage, and the people began murmuring that Anne no longer had a purpose. Then came the loss of her final pregnancy, another son who never drew breath. Henry's reaction was cold, almost indifferent. He no longer saw Anne as a source of hope, only as a reminder of his failures. On May 2nd, 1536, the hammer fell. Anne was arrested on charges of treason, adultery, and even incest with her brother, George Boleyn. The accusations were shocking, and many believed they were fabricated by Cromwell to rid the king of his troublesome wife. But Anne's pleas of innocence fell on deaf ears. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same place where she had spent the night before her coronation. Now, it would be her prison. Inside the cold stone walls of the tower, Anne reflected on her rise and fall. The woman who had once been fearless now felt the weight of every mistake, every misstep. Her thoughts were haunted by the faces of those she had alienated: Catherine, Mary, her brother George, and even Jane Seymour. She wondered if things might have been different if she had been more patient, more forgiving, less ambitious. Anne's days in the tower were filled with uncertainty. She knew that Henry controlled her fate, and she dared to hope that he might grant her mercy. But as the days passed, hope faded. She could feel the world closing in around her, the walls of the tower growing tighter with each passing moment. On May 15th, Anne was tried before a panel of nobles. The outcome was predetermined. She was found guilty on all counts. Stripped of her titles and her dignity, she was no longer Queen Anne Boleyn, but a condemned woman awaiting her end. As the sentence was read, Anne stood tall, refusing to let her enemies see her fear. If she was to fall, she would do so with grace. She spoke calmly, proclaiming her innocence and commending her soul to God. Her final days were spent in quiet reflection, writing letters to Henry and comforting the small group of loyal women who had remained by her side. She knew that history would judge her, but whether as a villain or a victim, she could not say. The early morning of May 19, 1536, began under a pale, heavy sky. Inside the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn prepared to face her fate with a sense of resolve. The woman who had once stood at the pinnacle of power and ambition was now reduced to a prisoner, waiting for the inevitable. But Anne did not collapse beneath the weight of her circumstances. Instead, she held her head high, determined to meet her end with the same grace and dignity that had defined her rise. She had already said her goodbyes to her ladies-in-waiting. They were the last companions who remained loyal, offering comfort as she tried to make peace with what was to come. In private, Anne struggled to suppress the growing knot of fear within her chest, but there was no turning back now. She knew that Henry had made his decision. There would be no pardon. As Anne stepped out of her chamber in the tower, the soft clink of chains echoed down the stone corridors. She wore a modest gray gown, her dark hair neatly pinned beneath a simple hood. It was a far cry from the elaborate dresses she had once worn as queen, but she had chosen it with care, determined to leave a lasting image of composure. Guards flanked her on either side as she made her way toward the scaffold. The walk was short but heavy with finality. She remembered her first arrival at the tower just 3 years earlier, when she had spent the night here before her coronation. Back then, the tower's walls had seemed welcoming, a symbol of the power she was about to claim. Now, they were a cage closing around her. At the scaffold, a small crowd had gathered nobles, courtiers, and commoners, all eager to witness the final moments of a fallen queen. Among them stood her enemies, their faces expressionless, but their eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Anne caught sight of Thomas Cromwell, the man who had orchestrated her downfall, standing toward the back. His expression was carefully neutral, but Anne knew that he had already moved on. For him, her end was merely the closing of a chapter, one step closer to securing his own ambitions. The crowd parted as Anne ascended the wooden steps of the scaffold. The air was thick with anticipation, but she moved gracefully, as if every step was a deliberate defiance of those who had betrayed her. She would not be remembered as a queen brought low by fear. She would face her fate on her own terms. Anne stood before the crowd, hands folded neatly in front of her. She did not look for pity, nor did she plead for mercy. Her voice was calm, steady, and free of bitterness as she spoke. "Good people," she began, "I am here to die according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die. I do not come here to accuse any man, nor to speak of what has been brought against me. I pray only that God will forgive my enemies, and that you will pray for my soul." Her words were brief but powerful, offering neither guilt nor recrimination. To those gathered, it was clear. Anne was determined to leave the world with dignity, refusing to be reduced to a mere cautionary tale. The executioner, a skilled swordsman brought from France at Henry's request, stood silently by. His sword gleamed in the dull morning light, waiting for its final task. Anne turned to him with a small smile. "I pray you, do not trouble yourself," she whispered. "I am ready." In the moments that followed, the air grew still, as if the world itself held its breath. Anne knelt gracefully on the wooden platform, her hands clasped in prayer. She stared ahead, her expression serene, as if seeing something beyond the crowd, beyond the moment. The swordsman moved quietly, waiting for the right moment to strike. A prayer left Anne's lips a final act of surrender, not to the king who had forsaken her, but to the higher power she believed would judge her fairly. Without warning, the sword swept through the air, and in one swift motion, Anne's life came to an end. The crowd gasped, some crossing themselves in shock, others whispering in hushed tones. Yet even in her final moments, Anne had achieved what she had set out to do. She had died without fear, with dignity intact. Her body was carefully wrapped, and her head placed beside it. There would be no grand funeral, no lasting monument. Instead, Anne's remains were quietly buried in an unmarked grave within the tower's chapel. But even in death, her story was far from over. Almost immediately after Anne's passing, whispers began to spread. Guards at the tower claimed to hear the sound of soft footsteps in the night, even when the corridors were empty. Others reported strange visions, flickering lights, and the fleeting shadow of a woman gliding through the halls. Some swore they saw Anne's figure, dressed in gray, wandering near the scaffold where she had drawn her last breath. These sightings were dismissed at first, mere figments of guilty minds or overactive imaginations. But as the years passed, the stories grew. Anne's presence was felt not only at the Tower of London, but also at Hever Castle, her childhood home, and Blickling Hall, where she was born. At each of these places, her ghost was said to appear sometimes serene, sometimes sorrowful, and occasionally carrying an air of quiet vengeance. Anne's spectral appearances became legend, blending fact and folklore into one haunting narrative. Some believed her spirit wandered because of the injustice she had suffered, while others thought she remained bound to the places that had defined her life. But whatever the reason, one thing was certain: Anne Boleyn was not at peace. As the years passed, Henry VIII moved on, marrying Jane Seymour just days after Anne's death. Jane gave him the son he so desperately desired, and Anne's name was quietly erased from court records. But despite the king's efforts to forget her, Anne's story refused to be buried. Her daughter, Elizabeth, grew up to become one of the most powerful monarchs in history, Queen Elizabeth I. Though Elizabeth rarely spoke of her mother, it was clear that Anne's spirit lived on through her. The strength, intelligence, and independence that had defined Anne's life found new expression in her daughter, who ruled England with an iron will and without a husband. Anne's enemies may have succeeded in taking her life, but they could not erase her legacy. Her story continued to haunt the corridors of power, a reminder of how ambition, betrayal, and love could shape the fate of nations. Those who study history often ask, was Anne Boleyn a victim or a villain? A woman betrayed by love, or an ambitious queen who overreached? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. But for those who believe in ghosts, Anne's restless spirit is not simply a reflection of guilt or sorrow. It is a testament to unfinished business. Her story lingers, not just in the pages of history books, but in the hearts of those who walked the same halls she once walked. Perhaps that is why her ghost endures, because Anne Boleyn, in life and in death, refused to be forgotten. After Anne Boleyn's execution, life at the royal court moved on, but her presence lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. The corridors of the Tower of London, where Anne had spent her final days, were filled with unease. At night, guards reported strange occurrences, flickering lights, soft whispers, and the sensation of being watched when no one else was present. It was as though the stones themselves had absorbed Anne's last moments, replaying them in an endless loop for those sensitive enough to notice. The rumors of Anne's spirit began quietly, spread in hushed conversations among servants and guards. At first, the reports were dismissed figments of guilty imaginations or tricks of tired minds. But as time passed, the stories grew more persistent. Even the most skeptical began to wonder if Anne's soul had truly moved on, or if she was trapped between two worlds, bound by the betrayal and injustice she had suffered in life. It was a cold autumn night when John Briggs, a young soldier stationed at the Tower of London, first saw her. He had been patrolling the grounds when he noticed a pale figure gliding silently along the stone path near the Queen's house, where Anne had been held before her execution. She wore a flowing gray gown, and though her face was partially obscured by the hood of her cloak, John felt certain it was Anne Boleyn. Frozen in place, he watched as the figure passed through a locked gate without a sound. Before he could summon the courage to follow, she vanished, leaving only the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. John tried to convince himself it was a trick of the moonlight, but deep down, he knew what he had seen. Anne Boleyn's spirit had returned. The story spread quickly through the tower, and soon others came forward with similar accounts. Some claimed to hear soft footsteps echoing down empty hallways, while others saw Anne's ghost standing near the scaffold, gazing out over the river as if reliving her final moments. The most unsettling reports came from those who saw her headless form wandering the grounds, her hands folded in prayer. Though terrifying, Anne's ghost did not seem malevolent. Those who encountered her described a sense of sadness rather than fear, as though she were searching for something or someone who could finally set her free. Anne's spirit was not confined to the tower. Sightings of her ghost were also reported at Hever Castle, her childhood home in Kent. Locals claimed to see Anne wandering the castle gardens on moonlit nights, her figure faint but unmistakable. She often appeared near the Umays, where she had once played as a child, her expression tinged with melancholy. Those who encountered her at Hever described the same sense of longing that accompanied her. presence at the tower. It was as if Anne's spirit was retracing the steps of her life, searching for moments of joy amid the sorrow. Some believed she was drawn to Hever because it represented the innocence she had lost long before the ambition, betrayal, and heartbreak that had defined her final years. On Christmas Eve, a local servant claimed to have seen Anne's ghost sitting by the fireplace in the great hall, her hands folded in her lap as she gazed into the flames. The servant swore that Anne's face, though spectral, bore a gentle smile, as if, for a brief moment, she had found peace. In Norfolk, the legend of Anne Boleyn's ghost took on a more ominous tone at Blickling Hall, where she was said to have been born. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, locals reported seeing a phantom carriage racing along the countryside, pulled by headless horses. Inside the carriage sat Anne Boleyn, dressed in white, her head resting in her lap. The sighting was said to be a grim reminder of her tragic fate, a queen who had lost everything, including her dignity and, some believed, her soul. The carriage would vanish as suddenly as it appeared, leaving behind only the faint rumble of wheels and the soft whinnying of phantom horses. No one dared follow it, for fear that encountering the spectral queen would bring misfortune. Yet, despite the fear surrounding these sightings, many felt sympathy for Anne, believing that her restless spirit was a reflection of the injustice she had suffered in life. Even within the royal court, Anne's name was not easily forgotten. Though Henry VIII married Jane Seymour soon after Anne's execution, his dreams of happiness were short-lived. Jane died shortly after giving birth to Henry's long-awaited son, leaving the king heartbroken. Some whispered that Anne's spirit had cursed the new queen, ensuring that Henry would never find lasting peace. Henry's later marriages fared no better, each ending in disaster. As the years passed, the once vibrant king grew bitter and paranoid. He began to see Anne's face in the most unexpected places, reflected in mirrors, flickering in candle flames, or staring back at him from the shadows of his chambers. Whether these visions were real or the product of a guilty conscience, no one could say. But one thing was certain: Anne Boleyn had not been forgotten. Even Princess Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was said to feel her mother's presence. Though Elizabeth rarely spoke of Anne publicly, those close to her believed that she carried her mother's memory with her throughout her life. On nights when the court was quiet, Elizabeth would sit alone in her chambers, tracing the outline of her mother's locket, a small gold pendant bearing Anne's initials. It was as if Elizabeth could feel Anne watching over her, guiding her toward the destiny she was meant to fulfill. The question of why Anne's spirit remained bound to the earthly realm haunted those who studied her life and death. Some believed she sought justice for the betrayal she had endured, justice that had never come in life. Others thought she wandered because of the love she had lost, her heart forever tied to the man who had abandoned her. But there were also those who believed Anne's spirit stayed not out of bitterness or sorrow, but out of loyalty. Perhaps she lingered to watch over Elizabeth, ensuring that the daughter she had sacrificed everything for would rise to greatness. Or perhaps Anne's spirit had become part of the fabric of England itself, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal and loss, the human spirit endures. As the centuries passed, Anne Boleyn's ghost became a fixture of English folklore. Tourists flocked to the Tower of London, Hever Castle, and Blickling Hall, hoping to catch a glimpse of the tragic queen's spirit. Some claimed to feel her presence, a sudden chill in the air, a soft whisper on the wind, or the faint scent of lavender drifting through an empty room. Though Anne's story was filled with tragedy, her ghost was not a symbol of defeat. Instead, it became a testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is strength to be found. Anne Boleyn may have lost her crown, her marriage, and her life, but her spirit endured, defying time and memory. And so, Anne Boleyn remains a haunting presence, not just as a ghost in the halls of old castles, but as a symbol of ambition, love, betrayal, and the undying quest for justice. Her story, like her spirit, will never truly be laid to rest. Years passed, yet Anne Boleyn's spirit remained. Her spectral presence was not one of violence or destruction, but of subtle, deliberate influence. The people she had touched in life, and the enemies who had betrayed her, felt her shadow looming over them, as though her memory refused to rest until the scales of justice were finally balanced. The ghost of Anne Boleyn did not seek vengeance through fear or anger. Her revenge was far more profound, carried out through the unfolding events in history. Bit by bit, the forces that had conspired against her found themselves haunted not by apparitions, but by the consequences of their ambition. King Henry VIII, once the most powerful man in England, found his life spiraling into ruin. Although he had succeeded in silencing Anne by taking her life, her absence seemed to cast an even deeper shadow over his reign. His marriage to Jane Seymour, which had promised him the son he craved, ended in sorrow when she passed away soon after childbirth. Though their son, Edward VI, was healthy, Henry's joy was short-lived. The king became plagued by illness, his body growing weaker and more distorted with each passing year. As he aged, he became increasingly isolated, lashing out at those around him. Those closest to him whispered that his decline was not just physical, but spiritual, that the ghost of Anne Boleyn haunted him, reminding him of the betrayal that had tainted his reign. Some claimed that in the darkest hours of the night, Henry would wake in a panic, seeing Anne's face in the shadows of his chamber. These visions, real or imagined, wore away at him. The man who had once ruled with confidence and power now lived in fear, haunted by the choices he could never undo. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne's downfall, had risen to prominence by doing the king's bidding. But just as he had helped orchestrate Anne's death, Cromwell soon found himself caught in the same web of betrayal. Ambition, like a double-edged sword, could turn on anyone, including its wielder. In 1540, Cromwell fell from grace. The same nobles who had once stood by his side conspired against him, accusing him of treason and heresy. He was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, the very place where Anne had met her end. While awaiting his execution, Cromwell was said to have seen Anne's ghost. She appeared to him in the dead of night, her expression serene but watchful, as if silently reminding him that betrayal never goes unpunished. Some claimed that Cromwell spoke Anne's name in his final moments, seeking her forgiveness. But forgiveness, if it ever came, was too late to save him. Cromwell's execution was swift and brutal, his head taken by the same sword that had claimed Anne's life. His death was a grim reminder that power, once seized, could just as easily be lost, and that justice, though delayed, would eventually come. Anne Boleyn's greatest triumph came not through revenge, but through her daughter, Elizabeth. Against all odds, Elizabeth survived the dangerous politics of the Tudor court, rising above the turmoil that had claimed so many before her. In 1558, she was crowned Queen of England, fulfilling the destiny that Anne had once dreamed of for her. Elizabeth carried her mother's memory with her throughout her reign. Though she rarely spoke of Anne publicly, those who knew her best believed that Anne's spirit guided her decisions. Elizabeth's reign was marked by strength, independence, and intelligence qualities she had inherited from her mother. One of the most striking aspects of Elizabeth's rule was her decision never to marry. Whether this choice was motivated by personal experience, political strategy, or a desire to avoid the fate that had befallen her mother, it was clear that Elizabeth would not allow herself to be used as a pawn in the same way Anne had been. She became known as the Virgin Queen, ruling with absolute authority and proving that a woman could govern without the need for a king. Elizabeth's success was a quiet but undeniable victory for Anne. Though Anne had lost her life, her legacy lived on through her daughter's reign, shaping the course of English history for generations to come. Anne Boleyn's spirit continued to influence the world, not as a vengeful ghost, but as a symbol of resilience and justice. Those who studied her life found inspiration in her story, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal and loss, dignity could be preserved and truth could endure. In the centuries that followed, Anne became more than just a tragic figure. She became a legend. Writers, historians, and artists were captivated by her story, portraying her as both a victim and a visionary. Some saw her as a warning about the dangers of ambition, while others viewed her as a pioneer, a woman who had dared to challenge the status quo and paid the ultimate price. Even in modern times, Anne's name remains a subject of fascination. Tourists flock to the Tower of London, Hever Castle, and Blickling Hall, hoping to catch a glimpse of her ghost. Her stories were told in books, films, and television shows, each interpretation adding new layers to the myth of Anne Boleyn. But perhaps the most lasting aspect of Anne's legacy is the sense of unfinished business that surrounds her. Though centuries have passed, there is a lingering feeling that Anne's story is not yet complete, that her spirit, in some form, still walks among us, waiting for the final chapter to be written. The ghost of Anne Boleyn serves as a reminder that justice is not always swift, but it is inevitable. Those who wrong others may believe they have escaped judgment, but the consequences of their actions have a way of catching up with them, sometimes in ways they could never have anticipated. Anne's revenge was not one of anger or destruction, but of endurance. She endured in the memories of those she had touched, in the downfall of those who had betrayed her, and in the triumph of her daughter's reign. Her story is a testament to the power of resilience, showing that even in the darkest moments, there is hope for redemption and justice. As long as her story is told, Anne Boleyn's spirit will never truly be at rest. She remains a haunting presence, not just in the halls of old castles, but in the hearts and minds of those who seek truth, justice, and dignity in a world that is often unjust. Though Anne Boleyn's earthly life had ended on the scaffold in 1536, her influence, both tangible and spectral, lived on through generations. Over the centuries, stories of her ghost continue to be told, not only in the Tower of London, but across England and beyond. Anne's name, once whispered in fear and scandal, grew into a symbol of both human frailty and unyielding strength. The echoes of her life, love, and betrayal persisted, reminding all who heard her story that time does not erase the truth, it merely reframes it. But Anne's spirit was more than just a figure of myth and legend. She had become a constant presence, as much a part of England's heritage as the very castle she was set to haunt. In the flicker of candles, the rustling of leaves in castle gardens, and the silent steps heard on stone corridors, people sensed her presence. A queen who had been taken too soon, but refused to fade into obscurity. As the fascination with Anne's story grew, she became a frequent subject of historical debate. Writers, historians, and scholars tirelessly revisited her life, questioning the motives behind her trial and the forces that led to her downfall. Some saw her as a woman driven by ambition, others as a victim of political machinations beyond her control. Yet all agreed on one thing: Anne Boleyn's story was far from ordinary. For many, Anne's ghost became a reflection of unresolved history. Her spectral appearances were seen not as terrifying encounters, but as reminders of human injustice. Each sighting represented a moment of reckoning, a call to remember that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually rise to the surface. Those who experienced these moments were often left not with fear, but with a profound sense of wonder and reflection. One of the most famous encounters occurred in the late 1800s when a historian named Lord Smythe claimed to have seen Anne's ghost during a private tour of the Tower of London. According to Smythe, the figure was not the headless specter described in folklore, but a woman with a calm, knowing expression. She appeared briefly at the scaffold site, gazing toward the river as though seeing something beyond time. Smythe later wrote in his journal that he felt not fear but a strange sense of peace, as if Anne's spirit wanted only to be remembered, not with sorrow, but with understanding. In modern times, Anne Boleyn's story continues to inspire countless works of art, literature, and film. Every new portrayal of her life offers a fresh interpretation, casting Anne not only as a tragic queen but also as a complex woman ahead of her time. In these retellings, she is a figure of courage, intelligence, and determination, a woman who refused to conform to expectations, even at the cost of her life. Anne's ghost has become a metaphor for the ways history can haunt the present. Her story resonates with those who feel silenced or betrayed, offering a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming opposition, the human spirit can endure. Many see her as an early symbol of feminist resistance, a woman who dared to challenge the conventions of her time and paid the ultimate price. Tourists still visit the Tower of London, Hever Castle, and Blickling Hall, hoping to feel a connection to Anne's spirit. Some report feeling a sudden chill in the air or catching the scent of lavender said to be Anne's favorite fragrance. Others hear faint footsteps or soft whispers, as though Anne's ghost walks among them, watching silently from the shadows. Elizabeth I's reign remains one of the greatest triumphs in English history. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth carried her mother's legacy into the future, proving that even the darkest beginnings could lead to greatness. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, her skillful diplomacy, and her unwavering strength made her a queen unlike any other. In many ways, Elizabeth fulfilled the destiny that Anne had envisioned, not only for herself but for all women who dared to defy the limits placed upon them. It is said that in her final moments, Elizabeth clutched a locket containing a portrait of her mother. Though separated by life and death, mother and daughter were connected by something deeper, an unbreakable bond forged by love, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Despite the countless books and films dedicated to Anne Boleyn's life, the full truth of her story remains elusive. New evidence occasionally surfaces, sparking renewed debate among historians, but the mystery surrounding her trial and execution may never be fully unraveled. This ambiguity only adds to Anne's allure, keeping her spirit alive in the imaginations of those who seek to understand her. Some believe that Anne's ghost continues to wander because her story remains unfinished. Perhaps there is still something she wishes to say, a truth that is yet to be uncovered. Or perhaps Anne's spirit endures not out of a need for resolution, but out of love for her daughter, for the future she never saw, and for the people who continue to remember her. Though Anne Boleyn's life was marked by betrayal and loss, her spirit has become a symbol of hope for those who feel trapped by circumstance. Her story reminds us that even when all seems lost, there is always the possibility of redemption. Anne's life may have ended on the scaffold, but her legacy lives on in the hearts of those who refuse to be forgotten. Her ghost, whether real or imagined, walks not to frighten or harm, but to inspire, to remind us that justice, though often delayed, will eventually come, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to surface. As centuries have passed, the legend of Anne Boleyn has grown, transforming her from a tragic queen into a timeless symbol of resilience. Though her spirit is said to wander still, perhaps she no longer seeks justice or revenge. Perhaps, after all these years, Anne's ghost walks simply because she chooses to, because her story, like her spirit, is too powerful to be contained by time. In the quiet moments, when the world is still, those who listen carefully may hear the faintest echo of Anne's footsteps. They may feel the slightest chill in the air, or catch the scent of lavender drifting through an open window. And in those moments, they will know that Anne Boleyn is not gone. She is merely waiting to be remembered, waiting to be understood, and waiting, perhaps, for the world to finally tell her story the way it was meant to be told. In the early 19th century, the Bell family lived a quiet, simple life in the small town of Adams, Tennessee. John Bell, the patriarch of the family, had worked hard to build a successful farm, where he lived with his wife, Lucy, and their children, including their daughter, Betsy. The farm sprawled across hundreds of acres, surrounded by dense forests, where the Bell family found peace and contentment. Life in the rural South was not easy, but the Bells were well respected in their community, known for their generosity and strong sense of morality. The Bell family's daily routines were like that of many families in the area. They rose with the sun, worked the fields, tended to livestock, and came together at the end of the day for dinner and prayer. But beneath this idyllic surface, something unsettling was beginning to take root, something that would soon shatter their peaceful existence. It started with small, almost imperceptible disturbances. At first, John Bell noticed odd occurrences around the farm doors, creaking open without cause. The occasional flicker of shadow in the corner of his vision, or the sound of footsteps in an empty room. At first, he brushed these things off as tricks of the mind, a tired farmer imagining things after long days of work. But soon, it became clear that these were not just idle imaginings. The disturbances grew louder, more frequent, and impossible to ignore. It wasn't long before Lucy and the children started to experience the same strange phenomena. They heard faint, whispering voices at night, unintelligible but persistent. Betsy, the youngest daughter, seemed especially affected, waking up from nightmares of unseen hands touching her, tugging at her blankets or whispering in her ear. Initially, the Bells tried to explain these occurrences away. They told themselves it was the wind, or perhaps an animal making noises in the walls. After all, the old house had its fair share of creaks and groans, and the forest surrounding the farm could easily produce such eerie sounds at night. But as time went on, these rational explanations no longer sufficed. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the strange occurrences reached a new level of intensity. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the house. It was as if someone or something was pounding on the walls from the outside. John jumped to his feet, certain that someone was playing a prank on them. He rushed outside, but there was no one to be found. The knocking continued from within the house, as though it was coming from the very walls themselves. The family was unnerved, but tried to dismiss it once again. They returned to their meal, but the atmosphere had changed. What had once been a warm and welcoming home was now filled with an air of dread. Over the next few days, the noises continued to grow louder and more violent. The strange knocking and thumping sounds seemed to follow the family wherever they went, even echoing through the halls in the dead of night. It wasn't long before other, more alarming phenomena began to occur. Objects moved on their own chairs, scraped across the floor. Doors slammed shut without explanation, and, most disturbingly, the Bell children reported feeling invisible hands grabbing at them during the night. Betsy, in particular, bore the brunt of the disturbances. At night, she would wake up screaming, her hair being pulled or her blankets yanked from her bed. No matter how tightly she held on to them, they would be violently ripped away. The once cheerful and energetic girl became pale and withdrawn, terrified of going to bed each night. Lucy, her mother, tried to comfort her, but even she could not deny that something unnatural was happening in their home. John Bell, ever the practical man, tried to keep his family grounded. He assured them that there had to be a logical explanation for these occurrences. Perhaps it was some kind of wild animal causing the noises, or a mischievous neighbor playing pranks on them. But deep down, even he was beginning to doubt his own words. As the disturbances persisted, the Bell family could no longer keep the strange happenings to themselves. Word began to spread throughout the small town of Adams, and curious neighbors came to witness the strange events for themselves. Some were skeptical, thinking it was all just a trick or an exaggeration. But others were convinced that the Bell family was truly being plagued by something beyond the natural world. One night, a neighbor named James Johnston and his wife came to stay with the Bells, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. They sat in the Bells' living room, waiting for the disturbances to begin. At first, everything was quiet, but then, just as the Bell family had described, the knocking started. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder and more insistent, as if something was trying to break through the walls. Johnston, a devout man, attempted to confront whatever was causing the noise, calling out into the air, demanding it to stop in the name of God. But instead of stopping, the knocking seemed to grow angrier. Over the course of the night, the Johnston couple experienced the same eerie phenomena that had been plaguing the Bells' disembodied voices, objects moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of dread. By the next morning, they left the Bell home convinced that something supernatural was at play. This was no prank or figment of the imagination. As word spread through the town, more people came to witness the strange events. But instead of bringing relief, the attention only seemed to fuel the disturbances. The whispers grew louder, and the unseen presence became bolder. Betsy's nightly torment worsened, and the entity began speaking more clearly, often calling out Betsy's name or mocking the family. The Bell family, once pillars of their community, began to withdraw. Friends and neighbors, though curious, started to distance themselves, fearful of becoming the next target of the mysterious force. John Bell's health began to decline, and the weight of the haunting seemed to take a toll on the entire family. Despite their prayers and their attempts to rid themselves of the entity, the Bell family was trapped in a nightmare that showed no signs of ending. And so, as the haunting intensified, the Bells could no longer deny the terrifying reality that had invaded their once peaceful home. The mysterious force that had begun as a series of minor disturbances was now an all-encompassing presence, one that threatened to tear their family apart, piece by piece. This was just the beginning. As the weeks passed, the disturbances at the Bell family farm became impossible to ignore. The entity, which the family had begun to refer to as the witch, grew more aggressive with each passing day. What had once been subtle knocks and whispers had now turned into full-fledged physical encounters, leaving the Bells terrified and desperate for answers. The witch began to speak clearly, often in a mocking, taunting tone. It seemed to take great pleasure in tormenting John Bell in particular, but no one in the family was immune to its wrath. Each night, the house echoed with sounds of scratching, tapping, and low growls. Objects flew across rooms, furniture shifted of its own accord, and at times, the presence of something sinister seemed to fill the air so completely that even breathing felt oppressive. One night, while the family sat huddled together in the living room, hoping for a few hours of peace, the entity made itself unmistakably known. Without warning, a cold wind blew through the room, even though all the doors and windows were closed tight. The candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. And then, in the silence that followed, a voice emerged from the shadows. It was low, raspy, and full of malice. "I am here," it said. The family froze in fear. John, ever the stoic father, tried to calm his wife and children, but his voice betrayed his unease. The voice continued, laughing softly, as if enjoying their terror. "John Bell," it whispered, "you will pay for your sins." The words hung in the air, chilling the room. John's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to show his fear. What sins could the witch possibly be referring to? He had always prided himself on being an honest, God-fearing man. But the witch's accusations unsettled him, as if it knew something about him that no one else did. The manifestations became bolder after that night. The witch no longer hid in the shadows, but seemed to revel in making itself known. At times, it would speak to the family for hours, mocking them, recounting details of their lives with eerie accuracy, and making ominous predictions about the future. The entity's voice was unsettling. It could sound like a whisper one moment, then shift into a growling, menacing tone the next. The Bell family soon realized they were not dealing with a mere ghost or poltergeist. This was something far more powerful and malevolent. The witch was not bound by the laws of the natural world, and its influence reached beyond the Bell home, affecting the nearby community as well. Neighbors and visitors who came to investigate the Bell Witch were often met with their own unsettling experiences. Some reported hearing the same mocking voice in their ears, while others felt invisible hands tugging at their clothes or hair. Word of the haunting spread far and wide, and soon people from neighboring towns and counties came to witness the strange happenings for themselves. Among the visitors was a local preacher named Reverend James Gunn. He had heard the stories about the Bell Witch, but dismissed them as exaggerations or folk tales. Determined to prove that there was nothing supernatural at play, he decided to visit the Bell home and see for himself. Upon entering the house, Reverend Gunn felt a heaviness in the air, but he remained resolute. He gathered the family together in the living room and led them in prayer, asking for God's protection and for the entity to leave the Bell family in peace. As the Reverend's voice filled the room, the witch remained silent. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Reverend's prayers had worked. The house was still, the air calm. But just as the family began to relax, a deafening noise erupted from the walls. The witch's voice cut through the chaos, laughing maniacally. "You think you can make me leave with your prayers?" It jeered. "I'm not going anywhere." The Reverend's face paled, but he continued to pray. The witch's voice grew louder, shouting over him, mocking him, twisting the words of his prayers into insults. The family watched in horror as the Reverend, usually a man of unshakable faith, faltered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the witch fell silent once more. Reverend Gunn left the Bell home that night, visibly shaken. He refused to speak of what had happened and never returned to the farm. His failure to dispel the entity only served to strengthen the witch's hold on the Bell family, and the haunting intensified. John Bell's health began to worsen in the days following the Reverend's visit. He grew weak and pale, often complaining of severe headaches and unexplained pains. Though he tried to keep up with his work on the farm, his strength was fading. The witch seemed to take delight in his suffering, frequently taunting him with cruel remarks. "You're not long for this world, John Bell," it would say, a hint of glee in its voice. "I'll see to that." The rest of the family, too, suffered under the witch's influence. Betsy Bell, already plagued by nightly disturbances, was now being physically attacked. The invisible hands that had once tugged at her blankets now slapped and pinched her, leaving her bruised and shaken. She grew more withdrawn, her once bright eyes now dull with fear and exhaustion. At times, the witch seemed almost playful, moving objects around the house or mimicking the voices of family members. But there was always an undercurrent of malice to its actions, as though it was testing the family's limits, pushing them closer and closer to the edge of despair. Despite the relentless torment, the Bell family tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. They continued their work on the farm, attended church, and did their best to keep the haunting a secret from those who hadn't already heard the rumors. But it was becoming increasingly clear that they were living under constant threat, and that no one, neither local preachers nor friends, could save them from the witch's wrath. The haunting took its toll, not just on the family's physical health, but also on their emotional and mental well-being. John Bell, once a strong and capable man, was now a shadow of his former self. Betsy, once full of youthful energy, seemed to wither under the weight of the witch's torment. And the rest of the family, though not as directly targeted, lived in constant fear of what might happen next. As the entity's power grew, so did its influence. The Bell family, once pillars of their community, were now seen as cursed. Neighbors once eager to help now kept their distance, afraid of being caught in the witch's web. Visitors from far and wide came to witness the haunting for themselves, but none could offer any real solutions or relief. The Bell Witch was no longer just a terrifying presence in their home. It had become an unstoppable force, determined to bring John Bell and his family to their breaking point. By the end of that long summer, the Bell family had been pushed to their limits. The witch's presence had grown stronger, more menacing, and it had singled out John Bell as the primary target of its relentless torment. John, once a strong, determined man, was now weakened, both physically and emotionally. His health had begun to deteriorate rapidly, and the more the witch mocked and cursed him, the more his condition worsened. John had tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, continuing his work on the farm and tending to the land, but the witch had made it nearly impossible. Each time he went outside, he felt a crushing weight on his chest, a pressure that seemed to drain his energy. His limbs would grow heavy, his head would throb, and his vision would blur. At times, he would collapse in the fields, barely able to breathe, only to hear the witch's mocking laughter echoing in his ears. "You'll not escape me, John Bell," the witch would whisper. "No matter where you go, I will follow." John's family watched helplessly as he grew weaker. Lucy, his wife, was heartbroken, doing all she could to nurse him back to health. She prepared herbal remedies, prayed constantly, and called upon neighbors for assistance, but nothing seemed to ease his pain. The witch's curse had taken hold of him, and it was clear that it had no intention of releasing its grip. As the haunting intensified, the witch's attacks on John became more personal and vicious. It wasn't just the physical toll it took on him. It was the emotional and mental assault that began to weigh him down. The witch's voice taunted him relentlessly, reminding him of past mistakes, whispering dark thoughts into his ear. "Do you really think anyone cares about you, John?" it would hiss. "Look at your family. They pity you. They're ashamed of you." The witch's cruel words seemed to seep into John's mind, and he began to withdraw from his family. Once a proud, strong father, he now spent long hours alone, unable to shake the feeling that the witch was right, that he had somehow brought this curse upon them all. Betsy Bell, John's daughter, continued to suffer as well. While the witch focused much of its energy on John, it hadn't abandoned its torment of her. Betsy was still plagued by nightly disturbances, her hair pulled, her blankets ripped from her bed, invisible hands leaving bruises on her skin. She would often wake up crying, terrified and exhausted. The witch seemed to take pleasure in tormenting both father and daughter, feeding off their shared despair. One evening, as the family gathered around John's bedside, the witch's voice rang out, louder than ever before. It spoke with a chilling certainty, its tone filled with malice. "John Bell," it declared, "your time is nearly up. I will see to it that you never leave this bed again." The family was frozen in fear, unable to respond. John lay pale and weak, his breathing shallow, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. The witch's words were a death sentence, and deep down, John knew that there was nothing he could do to escape its curse. The family sought help from a number of sources. Doctors were called in from nearby towns to examine John's failing health, but none of them could explain his symptoms. They offered little more than sympathy and a few ineffective treatments. Religious leaders continued to visit the farm, offering prayers and blessings, but the witch only grew more hostile in their presence, mocking their faith and driving them away. Despite the constant fear and the witch's taunts, the Bell family refused to abandon John. Lucy stayed by his side day and night, her devotion unshaken by the witch's threats. Betsy, too, remained close, though her own suffering was nearly unbearable. The witch's attacks had left her with nightmares and a deep sense of dread, but she couldn't bring herself to leave her father in his time of need. The town of Adams had once rallied around the Bell family, but now, many in the community had begun to keep their distance. Some feared that the curse might spread beyond the Bell household, while others whispered that John Bell had somehow deserved this fate, that the witch's curse was punishment for some unknown wrongdoing. Rumors circulated about John's past, about business deals gone wrong or possible feuds with neighbors, though nothing was ever confirmed. Still, the sense of isolation grew, and the Bell family found themselves more alone than ever. As John's health declined, the witch's visits became even more frequent. It no longer confined itself to the shadows or dark corners of the house. The family would often hear it moving through the rooms in broad daylight, knocking on walls, slamming doors, and throwing objects across the floor. The witch's voice was everywhere, filling the house with an oppressive sense of dread. "You can't hide from me," it would taunt. "I see everything." John's physical decline was now undeniable. His once robust frame had withered, and he could no longer leave his bed. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. The man who had once been the strength of the family was now reduced to a shell of his former self. It wasn't just the physical toll that worried his family. John had become quiet, withdrawn, as if the witch's constant taunts had broken something inside him. He would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, saying nothing. The witch's presence loomed over him, feeding on his fear and despair. Lucy tried to comfort him, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The once vibrant John Bell was fading away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The witch had made it clear that John's suffering would not end until his life was taken, and it seemed determined to carry out that promise. As the days turned into weeks, John's condition worsened, and the witch's taunts grew more ominous. It began to speak of John's death as though it was inevitable, as though it was simply waiting for the right moment to claim him. "Your time is near, John Bell," the witch would whisper. "You can't run from fate." John's family clung to the hope that anything might intervene to save him. But with each passing day, that hope dwindled. The witch's power was too great, its grip on John too strong, and in their hearts, the Bell family knew that they were fighting a battle they couldn't win. Despite their prayers, despite their efforts to rid themselves of the entity, the curse had taken its toll. John Bell's life was slipping away, and the witch was the unseen hand guiding him toward the end. In the cold light of autumn, the Bell family was forced to face the grim reality that the witch's prophecy might be fulfilled, and that John Bell's fate was sealed. By the time autumn had turned to winter, John Bell's fate seemed inevitable. His once strong frame was now frail and weak, his breath shallow, and his mind dulled by the constant torment of the Bell Witch. The family had watched helplessly as he deteriorated day by day, his strength slowly fading. It was clear to everyone John Bell would not survive much longer. The witch's voice had become a constant presence in the Bell home, its taunts crueler and more direct. It had stopped hiding in the shadows or limiting its torment to the night. The entity now spoke openly, addressing John by name, mocking his frailty and delighting in his suffering. "John Bell," the witch would hiss, "your end is near. I will see to it that you never leave that bed alive." John, too weak to respond, simply lay there, his eyes glazed over. The energy and life that had once filled him were gone. The relentless presence of the witch had taken everything from him, his health, his peace of mind, and even his will to fight. Lucy Bell, ever the devoted wife, stayed by John's side day and night. She prayed for a miracle, but deep down, she knew there would be no saving her husband. The curse had become too powerful, and John was too far gone. She held his hand and whispered words of comfort to him, though she knew he could no longer hear her. The witch's voice drowned out everything, filling the air with its poisonous words. As John's health deteriorated, the family began to prepare for the worst. Neighbors who had once avoided the Bell home now came to offer their condolences, though there was little they could do to help. The curse that had gripped John Bell was beyond their understanding, and most of them believed that his fate had been sealed long ago. One cold December morning, John Bell's condition took a sudden and dramatic turn for the worse. His breathing became shallow and labored, and his skin took on a pale, almost ghostly hue. Lucy, realizing the end was near, gathered the family around his bedside. Betsy, her face tear-streaked, sat close, clutching her father's hand. She had suffered as much as he had, haunted by the witch's attacks and nightly torment, but she refused to leave him in his final moments. As the family watched over him, the witch's voice rang out once more, filling the room with its mocking laughter. "It's time, John Bell," the witch jeered. "You can't escape me. Your suffering is almost over." John Bell's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, but he was too weak to respond. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest rising and falling with great effort. The witch's voice seemed to hang in the air, as if it was waiting for something. Then, suddenly, John's body convulsed, and his breathing stopped altogether. Lucy gasped, reaching for her husband, but it was too late. John Bell was gone. A stunned silence filled the room as the reality of his death sank in. The family, overwhelmed with grief, wept quietly. But their sorrow was soon interrupted by the witch's triumphant voice. "I did it," the witch declared with unmistakable glee. "John Bell is dead, and I have won." The room seemed to grow colder as the entity's words echoed through the house. It was a chilling, victorious statement, one that left no doubt that the witch had claimed John Bell's life as it had promised to do. There was nothing left to fight, no hope of a last-minute reprieve. The Bell Witch had carried out its curse to its fullest extent. Despite their heartbreak, the family had no time to process their grief. The witch's presence continued to loom over them, reminding them that John's death was not the end of its influence. As the days passed, the family prepared for John's burial. The once well-respected man would be laid to rest in the family's private cemetery, but even in death, there was no peace. On the day of John Bell's funeral, the witch's voice could be heard during the service, cackling and mocking the mourners. It taunted them as they lowered John's body into the ground, declaring that it had brought about his death and that no one could have stopped it. Those in attendance were horrified, but they could do nothing. The entity's hold over the Bell family had extended even into John's final moments. As the last shovelful of earth was placed over John's grave, the witch spoke one last time. "I will never forget what I've done here," it said, its voice filled with satisfaction. "John Bell's death was my doing, and I will celebrate it for all eternity." The funeral ended in a somber, haunted silence, with those who had gathered feeling the weight of the supernatural event they had just witnessed. The story of the Bell Witch had already spread far and wide, but now it seemed undeniable. A force beyond human understanding had taken the life of John Bell, and it had done so in full view of the entire community. In the days following John's death, the witch's activity in the Bell home subsided somewhat, but it did not disappear entirely. The entity continued to make its presence known, though it seemed less focused on tormenting the family. The nights were quieter, with fewer disturbances, but the fear of the witch's return still hung in the air like a dark cloud. Betsy Bell, still grieving the loss of her father, was not entirely free from the witch's attention. Though the entity had shifted its focus, it had not entirely abandoned its attacks on her. Betsy continued to experience eerie occurrences, objects moving on their own, strange noises in the night, and the occasional whisper of the witch's voice in her ear. The witch's influence had not left the Bell family, even in the wake of John's death. As the weeks turned into months, the Bell family did their best to move on. They continued to run the farm, attended church, and tried to resume their normal lives. But the memory of John's death and the witch's role in it lingered. The curse that had claimed his life was a shadow that none of them could escape. For many in the community, John Bell's death became a cautionary tale proof that the Bell Witch was real and that its power was something to be feared. Though some still questioned whether the story had been exaggerated, those who had witnessed the events firsthand knew the truth. The Bell Witch was not just a legend. It was a living, malevolent force, and it had left an indelible mark on the Bell family, one that would be remembered for generations to come. And so, the Bell family tried to carry on, forever haunted by the memory of the curse that had taken John Bell's life. The witch had claimed its victory, but its shadow still lingered, reminding them that the past could never be truly forgotten. After John Bell's death, the Bell family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The curse that had haunted them for so long had taken its toll, and the sense of loss was overwhelming. Though the witch's torment had lessened, its presence still lingered, and the scars it had left behind, both physical and emotional, were deep. The Bell Witch had claimed its victory, but the family was left to endure its lingering effects. For Betsy Bell, the loss of her father weighed heavily on her heart. She had suffered greatly under the witch's torment, and even now, with her father gone, she was not free. The witch's presence still made itself known in subtle ways, like a constant reminder of the darkness that had plagued their home. Strange noises continued to echo through the house at night, and Betsy still felt the occasional tug on her hair or the whisper of her name in the dark. It was as if the witch had left a part of itself behind, refusing to let go entirely. Despite the ongoing disturbances, the family tried to move on. They continued to run the farm and live their lives as best they could. But things were never the same. The once lively and joyful Bell household had become a place of silence and fear. Neighbors who had once visited regularly now stayed away, and the family found themselves isolated, left to cope with their grief and the remnants of the haunting. Betsy, in particular, struggled to find a sense of peace. The witch had focused much of its energy on her throughout the years, and she had endured countless nights of terror. Even though the witch no longer tormented her with the same intensity, the trauma of the past haunted her. She couldn't escape the memories of being attacked, mocked, and manipulated by an unseen force. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just the haunting that troubled Betsy. It was the uncertainty of what the witch had truly wanted. Why had it chosen to torment her family? Why had it fixated on her father with such hatred? These questions gnawed at her, but no answers ever came. The witch's motivations remained as mysterious as ever, and the lack of closure left Betsy with a constant sense of unease. As Betsy grew older, she tried to find solace in her relationships. She had been courted by a local boy, Joshua Gardner, before the witch's attacks had begun. The two had been close, and many in the community believed they would one day marry. However, the witch's interference had cast a dark shadow over their courtship. The entity had taken a particular interest in Betsy's romantic life, often mocking her and Joshua during their time together. The witch had made it clear that it disapproved of their relationship, and the constant torment became too much for Betsy to bear. After her father's death, the strain on her and Joshua's relationship intensified. The witch's presence was always lurking, and Betsy feared that it would never allow her to live a normal life. Eventually, under the weight of the supernatural interference, Betsy made the difficult decision to end her engagement to Joshua. It was a heartbreaking choice, but she believed it was the only way to protect him from the witch's wrath. With her engagement broken and her family still grieving, Betsy felt lost. The witch had not only taken her father, but had also robbed her of her future with Joshua. She wondered if she would ever be able to escape the curse that had followed her for so long. The constant presence of the Bell Witch had left her with deep emotional wounds that refused to heal. Though the Bell family's suffering had been immense, their story spread far beyond the borders of Adams, Tennessee. Word of the Bell Witch haunting reached people across the state and even beyond. The tale of a malevolent spirit that had tormented a family so relentlessly became a point of fascination, with many curious onlookers traveling to the Bell Farm to see the infamous house for themselves. Among those who took an interest in the Bell Witch case was none other than General Andrew Jackson, who would later become the President of the United States. According to local legend, Jackson had heard the stories of the Bell Witch and decided to investigate the haunting for himself. He and a group of men traveled to the Bell Farm, eager to see if the supernatural tales were true. As the story goes, Jackson's group experienced firsthand the power of the Bell Witch. It is said that their carriage suddenly stopped in its tracks as they approached the farm, as if an invisible force had taken hold of the horses. No matter how hard they tried, they could not get the carriage to move. Jackson, reportedly intrigued but also unnerved, declared that he had encountered something beyond his understanding. His men, terrified by the experience, begged him to turn back. Whether or not the story is entirely true, it added to the growing legend of the Bell Witch and solidified its place in American folklore. In the years following John Bell's death, the Bell family tried to move forward, but the witch's legacy remained. People in the community continued to speak of the haunting, and it became a cautionary tale passed down through generations. Many believed that the Bell Witch's curse had not truly ended, that its presence still lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Betsy, too, eventually moved on with her life. She married another man, Richard Powell, and left the Bell Farm behind. Though she tried to distance herself from the trauma of the past, the memories of the witch's attack stayed with her. She remained cautious, always looking over her shoulder, afraid that the witch might one day return to torment her again. As time passed, the Bell Witch became a fixture of local legend. Stories of the haunting were told and retold, each version slightly different from the last. Some claimed the witch had been a vengeful spirit, while others believed it was a demon sent to punish John Bell for his sins. There were even those who speculated that the witch had never been real at all, that it was a product of the family's fears and the power of suggestion. But for those who had lived through it, especially the Bell family, the witch was all too real. Its power had been felt in every corner of their lives, and the pain it had caused was undeniable. The Bell Witch haunting left an indelible mark on the family and the community, a haunting reminder that some forces in the world cannot be easily explained or defeated. In the end, the Bell family survived, but they were forever changed. The witch had claimed its victory with John Bell's death, but its true legacy was the fear and uncertainty it left behind. Even years after the haunting had subsided, the Bell Witch remained a presence in their lives, a shadow that would never truly fade. And so, the story of the Bell Witch lived on past from generation to generation, a tale of darkness, mystery, and the enduring strength of a family who had faced the unimaginable and survived.